So my name is Daisy DeLoco. I'm the academic director of the University of Chicago Center in Paris, and it's a really great pleasure for us to be able to welcome in our New World webinar format that we've all become accustomed to, this conference on slavery, racism, and empire in the history of medicine, organized by Elodie, Edwards-Grossi, and Christopher Willoughby. It's fortunate actually that we're in a webinar format because it allows for much more participation actually than the in-person. Our salle de séminaire can accommodate in pre-COVID times about 45 or 50 people, but with social distancing, not that many. So we're really happy to be able to offer you this platform and wish you a great webinar.
Thank you. We are very happy to welcome you to this symposium today on Zoom. And of course, it would have been more convivial to organize this meeting in Paris, but due to the current constraints, Zoom felt like a better and safer option for everyone, especially since we have participants speaking from France and from the US. Chris and I would like to thank our sponsors for the event, the U-Chicago Center in Paris, for their help in managing this online event, and the lab CAS at Université Toulouse Jean Jaurès, which has supported the event from the very start. And our idea was to organize a joint event to allow French and American researchers working on topics relating to slavery, empire in the 18th and 19th century, but also on the legacies of these political and social systems to get to know each other and also to share the latest findings in the field. And I have to say that the symposium comes at the right time, especially since there are so many great books that have come out in 2021 and 2020. The latest to date actually being the book co-edited by Chris and Sean Morey-Smith, whose title is Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, and which comes out this November with Louisiana State University Press. I will chair panel 1, Race, Medicine, and Institutional Histories in the US, which will take place from 4 p.m. Paris time to 5:50 p.m. And then we will have a 10-15 minutes break, depending on how long panel 1 will be. And we will resume the symposium with panel 2, Medical Racism and Empire, at 6 p.m. with Chris chairing panel 2. We'll have a joint Q&A session at the end of each panel after the respondents' comments, so please prepare your questions in the chat box for the Q&A, and we will engage with them later on. One of the participants in panel 2, Raphaël Gallien, had unfortunately to drop out, so we will have 2 panelists on panel 2, but this will allow us to have more time for questions and comments at the end. So we can start right away with panel 1.
Well, and I want to introduce our first panelist, step over and chair for a second here, which is my great co-host, Elodie Edwards-Grossi. She's an associate professor in American Studies at the University Paris Dauphine in France. Sometimes Zoom takes over your computer and you have to continue reading. So in 2017, 2018, she received the Fulbright and Georges Lercy Fellowships to complete her dissertation in the Department of History at Tulane University as a visiting research fellow. Her research focuses on the social history of racialized psychiatry in the segregated South and the medicalization of the Black body from the 19th century to the contemporary era. She has recently published the book Bad Brains, La Psychiatrie et la lutte des morts. I'm so bad it's not speaking French, but Americans pour la justice raciale, and oh my gosh.
It's okay, you don't have to read the entire subtitle.
With the press, the University of Rennes. She has also published articles in Endeavor, Social Science Information, and the French Review of American Studies. Her forthcoming book is under contract with LSU Press, so monolingual people like myself can read it for fall 2022. and is provisionally titled Mad with Freedom, Political Economy of Blackness, Insanity, and Civil Rights in the US South, 1840 to 1930. And I know Elodie's American fans will really be looking forward to that. So with that, Elodie, please take us off, and I look forward to hearing your paper.
Thank you, Chris. So in April 1889, Joseph Jones, the professor of chemistry and clinical medicine in the Department of Medicine at Tulane University in New Orleans, delivered a long-expected address to the Louisiana State Medical Society for its 11th annual session. His speech was soberly entitled Diseases of the Nervous System and provided an exhaustive report on the latest medical advances in Louisiana. In front of a galvanized audience composed of the Louisiana medical elite, Jones gave an account of the classifications adopted by the professors of medicine at his university to classify and treat patients in the surrounding hospitals. Detailing the cases of madness that he had encountered during his practice at the charity hospital and public asylums of the state, Jones dwelled particularly on the category of political excitement, a cause of insanity which, according to him, affected Black patients in particular in Louisiana, and alongside religious excitement. In his opinion, quote, political excitement and certain political and race changes, such as those wrought by the Great American Civil War of 1861-1865, and of quote, constituted mental disorders, causing the patient to enter a state of madness that Jones described as demoniacal. According to him, the Civil War produced political changes of such magnitude, the emancipation of slaves, that the population directly concerned, freed slaves in the South, became more susceptible to episodes of madness. Himself a Confederate veteran and an active and enthusiastic member of Southern medical societies, Jones defended a medical and political apparatus based on white supremacy and anti-Black violence in the post-emancipation period by producing naturalizing discourses on Black freedom and mental illness. This paper will present my forthcoming monograph that Chris just mentioned, which deals with how Southern physicians such as Jones organized differential therapeutic treatments to cure Black patients in the Southern state hospitals, while pathologizing political emancipation and naturalizing their Black patients' capacity to work in a docile way. The book explores the largely unknown social history of racialized theories on insanity in the segregated South and the medicalization of the Black body from the 1840s until the 1930s. White physicians, using their scientific authority and public visibility, were simultaneously politicizing medical theories and medicalizing political deviance. The first two chapters propose a social history of medical diagnoses relating to madness and other behavioral disorders in the Black population in the Southern states before the Civil War. The focus is on the early theories developed by doctors such as Joseph Jones and Stanford Emerson Chaillet from the Louisiana School of Medicine at the University of Louisiana in New Orleans about slaves and their behavioral problems. Their theories were given a second lease of life in the 1860s, when anti-abolitionists quoted them in order to proclaim that Black freedmen became insane when confronted with the complexities of freedom, thus politicizing a medical argument. Chapter 3 deals with the opening of the Central State Hospital at Petersburg, Virginia, and the Eastern North Carolina Insane Hospital at Goldsboro, and the Central Louisiana State Hospital at Pineville in Louisiana during and after Reconstruction, a period that marks the death knell of the antebellum regime after 1865. This chapter also explores the systematic reluctance of whites to finance a system of public assistance to Blacks. Building on the discussion of various physicians' personal writings and the functioning of the hospitals in those various Southern states, such as Robert F. Baldwin, Martin Scott, James Bargdall, Joseph Jones, Louis Charles Roudanet, J.D. Roberts, The chapter unveils the poor material conditions of these institutions, as well as their punitive nature. For example, the chapter reveals how work was conceived as part of the moral therapy postulation that activities organized in the specifically designed setting of the asylum offered a potential cure to madness. The notion of therapeutic work and moral treatment, which had been introduced by French alienist Philippe Pinel in his Traité médico-philosophique sur l'aliénation mentale, took a new turn in the South when his theories were applied to control and cure the black patients of state institutions at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, during a period in which Southern political culture based on nostalgia became even more prevalent and permeable as it mixed with broader national discourses to give new definitions of race and belonging. Penning a note in 1872 for the annual report of his institution, Daniel Burr Conrad, the first superintendent of the Central Lunatic Asylum in Virginia, mentioned with enthusiasm the curative virtues of work in relation to the supposed laborious nature of Black patients and their former status as slaves. Quote, "From our experience during the past 2 years, work with the hands is regarded here as elsewhere as the most powerful hygienic and curative agents and influences, which are classed under the general heading of moral treatment, and we are inclined to think that this manual labor is the chief, if not the only means of cure we possess for this class of our insane, coming as they all do from the totally uneducated former slave class." End of quote. In his statement, Conrad made a clear link between moral treatment in the form of labor and the supposedly innate propensity amongst Black men and Black women to engage in arduous labor. According to him, Black patients to flourish anew needed a simple and repetitive living environment based on the lifestyle of the Old South. Thus, the export of moral therapy in the post-slavery South took on a very special local hue. By naturalizing phenotypical and epidemiological differences, Daniel Burr Conrad and his colleagues justified the segregation of racialized bodies in public and private spaces, and by extension, their inequality. Following these 3 chapters, the book retraces the experiences of the very first Black patients admitted to psychiatric institutions in the South after the 1870s. Chapter 4 examines the organization of distinct racialized workspaces specific to Black patients whose care was organized in relation to physical work, thus illustrating white doctors' efforts to view patients' labor as a curative tool to returning freed men and freed women to sanity by bringing them back to what was seen as their natural laboring condition of slaves. The type of work performed, however, depended on a complex racialized and gendered division of labor within the hospital. Penning his memoirs in 1934, James Lawrence Thompson, who officiated at the South Carolina State Hospital, evoked the racial and sexual hierarchy between Black and white patients. Thompson indicated that while, quote, "white females would make beds, sweep the floors, sew, work in the kitchen, and even sweep the yards," end of quote, the Black female patients, quote, "would work on the wards in various ways and in the laundry," end of quote. Thompson also recalled that the Black male patients, quote, "did most of the rough work, such as working on the farm, cutting wood, and the like," end of quote, since, quote, "the white males were somewhat handicapped in the work, as it was not customary to have both populations working together," end of quote. Thompson further justified this functioning by saying that they, quote, "did not have land enough to have the white males work on the farm, hence they were confined to work mostly in cleaning up the yard and moving trash from about the building," end of quote. These tasks were formulated according to tales of white fragility, while the oddest physical efforts were attributed to Black men as a way to strengthen the social control of Black masculinity within the hospital walls. A collection of photographs taken at the Central Louisiana State Hospital in Pineville further illustrates the specific racialized and gendered division of labor within these hospitals in the late 1920s and 1930s. Although these photographs seem to have been staged, they provide ample information about differential routinized activities and work sessions organized for Black and white patients within the hospital. Occupational therapy activities for white men and white women were conducted in a spacious garden, the patients being seated on chairs placed in a circle in order to interact with each other. White women, for their part, benefited from a beauty salon, which was opened in the hospital in the 1930s, as shown in this photograph, while white men had the possibility of taking an outdoor carpentry class or a gymnastics class. Camaraderie and social interactions amongst the white patients may have provided encouragement, aid, and defense against the hospital's regimen and acts of mortification. As documents that were published in the annual reports of the institutions and presented to the administration of the governor of each state to justify their proper functioning, these documentary photographs further demonstrate how the medical staff and the photographer aim to construct a public image for the hospital as an institution committed to the curative regime of moral therapy, all while catering to the tastes, proclivities, and activities of white patients. The annual reports from the 1910s and 1930s of this Louisiana State Institution also include photographs of Black patients who are shown performing different tasks, also labeled as diversional occupation. Black men are shown hard at work, mowing the vast lawn or cultivating potatoes in the extensive agricultural fields surrounding the hospital, with no possibility of social interaction taking place between them. Furthermore, the visual archives, which depict a gendered and racialized division of labor, is further aligned with the patient's social origins and trajectories before their internment. All in all, the discourses of cure and recovery in such treatment regimen were predicated upon the Black patient's ability to work and their docility, whereas the medical discourses concerning white patients were coded around their capacity to espouse white ideals of domesticity and white vulnerability. Contrary to the systems of forced labor implemented in carceral institutions, as shown in works by specialists of Southern history in prisons, such as Talitha Lifloria and David Oshinsky, physicians use labor as a tool for therapeutic endeavors and as a pathway to curability and redemption. Overall, the medical staff constructed the public image of Black patients at the Central Louisiana State Hospital in the 1930s in relation to former theories of labor, docility, and race that had started to be developed all the way back in the 1870s in Southern hospitals. Chapter 5 first looks closely at the ways psychiatrists at the beginning of the 20th century categorized specific groups of people as mulattoes, Africans, and American Blacks as distinct entities to which they attributed different symbolic meanings in the context of discussing sexual deviance and at a time when passing and interracial relationships were especially taboo in the South. The second part of this chapter, which is the final chapter of the book, then examines the rise of psychoanalytic theories that tackled Black bodies after psychoanalysis became a new popular field in the 1910s in the US, following the first publication of the volumes of the Psychoanalytic Review in 1913, 4 years after Sigmund Freud's first visit to the US. This chapter proves the influence of European psychoanalysts such as Alfred Adler and Sigmund Freud on this new type of racist writings. It can be clearly demonstrated that Southern physicians imported their theories on dreams, wish fulfillment, and the inferiority complex, which made no mention of race, and adapted them to the local segregated context of the US South. This last chapter, therefore, investigates the tensions that existed between, on the one hand, the international standardization of science as an ongoing process, and on the other hand, the local epidemiologies pertaining to the Black population. I would like to take a slight turn and rely on critical race theory and whiteness studies in an attempt to shift the focus away from medical theorists. Looking at case studies, the monograph also attempts to reveal the localized and subtle techniques of resistance employed by Black patients to confront the medical power. Even if most of their names and voices have been lost, the book attempts to reclaim their place in history. Black patients were not necessarily passive and docile in the face of this arbitrary medical power. Daniel Burke-Conrad, the superintendent of the Central State Hospital at Petersburg, Virginia, recounted in 1872 that Black patients' resistance to what white physicians envisioned as therapeutic work emerged in his institution. Quote, "Some involuntary laborers object to work on the ground of its reducing them to their former slave state, making them work without pay. They say that if well enough to work, they are well enough to be discharged." Patients' resistance exemplifies what philosopher Michel Foucault stated as, quote, "the insidious way in which madmen forcefully asked for the truth in relation to a psychiatric power which strove to impose its reality," end of quote. Here, it is not a simulation of madness within madness, as Foucault puts it, but rather a revelation of the capacity for resistance by calling into question the arbitrary and coercive treatment put in place by the hospital staff and opposing scientific rationalization. If the names and identities of these patients have often been erased from the registers, they are seldom named individually, for example. These testimonies prove that Black patients were well aware of the contradiction between their status as patients and the work they were doing for free. Most of them or their parents had been subjected to slavery, and they in particular recognized that their labor force was a vital contribution to their freedom. Abraham Tibbs, a Black patient admitted in 1910 to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., was aware of the paradox of patients' work in state hospitals, which operated as punitive, if not medical apparatuses. Quote, "The only time I got good sense is when I'm working for nothing, but when I ask for pay like you would, then I am out of my mind and insane," end of quote. To the violence of the white Southern medical power, Abraham Tibbs opposed irony, and in so doing denaturalized the power relationship that the doctor had striven to normalize. Against medical knowledge, he used his subject knowledge, a form of knowledge that Foucault deemed non-conceptual, and he made his voice subversive by bringing to light the unfair exploitation of his labor force in order to prove his right to freedom. To conclude, Black patients' resistance and voices nonetheless made themselves heard in the hospitals, and they helped sketch out the complex power game that existed between the representatives of medical power and their patients. There is no doubt that this subjugation of bodies and minds slowly but surely rekindled the flame of emancipation, echoing the lines of the poem Black Workers by Langston Hughes. The bees work. The work is taken from them. We are like the bees, but it won't last forever. Thank you. So now it's time for me to introduce our second panelist, who is also my co-host for today's event. Christopher D.E. Willoughby is a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and the Molina Fellow in the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences at the Huntington Library. His work focuses on the role Atlantic slavery and scientific racism played in shaping the curriculum of medical schools in the past and present. He has published many peer-reviewed essays in the New West Indian Guide, the Journal of Southern History, and the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. His editorials, reviews, and blogs have been published by the Washington Post, Black Perspectives, and the Oxford University Press blog. He's the editor of the book Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, which was published by LSU Press this year. He's the author of Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in US Medical Schools, which will be published by the University of North Carolina Press in fall 2022, and which he will present to us today.
Thank you for that. Welcome, Elodie, and it's really great to be here. And I really appreciate, I should say, when Elodie reached out to me about wanting to organize this, because she's one of my favorite people to work with in academia, and it's a real pleasure to be here and outside of academia as well. So I wanted to start here where my research began almost 15 years ago as a naive student, looking at the title of one of Josiah Nott and George Glidden's racial science tomes. This one is Indigenous Races of the Earth. I'd begun studying the history of racial science then, and I wondered why something so absurd seemed so persuasive to contemporaries. As I studied the title page closer, I first noticed all the MDs of the various contributors and one of the compilers, Josiah Nott, which you can see down here at the bottom. Then I noticed something even more peculiar, at least peculiar to me at the time, even though it's so familiar now. Many of the contributors were faculty at major medical schools in the US North. So I'm looking here, J. Atkins Meeks. He's at this time a professor at the Philadelphia Medical College, but will move over to the more prestigious Jefferson Medical College. Professor Joseph Leidy, who contributes a letter, is a professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania, then the most prestigious medical school in the United States, and Professor Louis Agassiz, a professor at the Lawrence School of Science at Harvard, perhaps also the most famous scientist in the United States, especially on the back of his support of the theory of polygenesis, which I'll discuss more today. At that point, most of the books I had read on the history of racial theory in the United States depicted racial science as the domain of pro-slavery charlatans. Why, I wondered, were Ivy League professors in New England contributing to a racial science text? More pressing, were they teaching racial science to their medical students? Well, that seems like a lifetime ago. At its core, these are some of the central questions that my forthcoming book, Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery in US Medical Schools, answers. My book manuscript takes the history of the medical profession's exploitation of African-descended people's bodies for knowledge production back to the first medical schools in the United States, historicizes a deep structural relationship between the growth of medical schools and the need for scientific justifications of white supremacy and slavery in the age of abolition. My very title, moreover, alludes to two forms of mastery that medical students were trained to imbue: the enslavers and the dissectors. In this way, my book is building on scholarship on medical and enslaver mastery by Michael Sapple and Walter Johnson. I argue that these ways of analyzing bodies coalesce together in the medical school. Both dissecting rooms and slave markets were homosocial spaces. Enslavers collectively analyzed bodies to predict their labor capacity, and medical students stood together over the cadaver to understand the bodily effects of disease and sometimes race. Antebellum racial science and its introduction into medicine brought these cultures together and ensured physicians' ability to use both anatomical and enslaver methods to imagine a vision of racial difference rooted in separate and seemingly permanent anatomies. Thus, in Masters of Health, at its core, I'm revealing how medical students were trained and socialized to be experts on African descendants' bodies, and how this expertise contributed to the professionalization and growth of medicine in the United States. Through a reading of more than 4,000 medical student dissertations by white male youths from diverse class and geographic backgrounds, I'm accessing how the typical US physician understood African descendants' bodies and their appropriate treatment. Medical students collectively reimagined Black people as anatomically distinct, suited for hard labor, and capable of being experimented upon in ways unfit for white people's bodies. My emphasis then on student writing represents a significant departure from previous scholarship on racial science, in that they mostly focused on elite theorists previously. This archival research into student and faculty records on medical pedagogy also complements select counter-narratives of Black lives that were disrupted by the actions of medical faculty and students. So through these caches of theses, at the Medical College of South Carolina, which is in Charleston, Transylvania University, which is in Lexington, Kentucky, the University of Nashville in Tennessee, and the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I'm able to illuminate how racism emerged and was proliferated through the writings of middle-class, rural, and small-town doctors, as well as elite racial scientists. The first 4 chapters study this history primarily through a domestic story, tracing out 4 key themes: the rise of medical schools in the US, the rise of racial science, what I call the clinical racial gaze, and this is studies the kind of collision of these 2 ways of looking at the body through an analysis of first, the Parisian clinics of the 19th century and American students' experiences in them, and then second, the way enslavers analyze bodies and markets. And then finally, how these racial theories shaped practices like body snatching and anatomical pedagogy, which I will specifically discuss in greater depth later today. Additionally, the book ends with 3 chapters connecting the history of slavery and medical schools to the US's emerging role as an imperial and capitalist power. These last chapters analyze the purchase of stolen skulls from around the world to make racial exhibits, select stories of the diverse people whose skulls were stolen, the role of international travel in globalizing racial theories, and how emergent concepts of environmental health were used to justify imperialism abroad and slavery at home in the United States. Thus, my book takes the story of slavery in medicine that is so often associated with rural plantations and instead reveals its influence on elite, cosmopolitan institutions that have endured through much of the history of US medicine and into the present. For the remainder of my talk, I want to give a brief outline of my book's contextual interventions, which are essential to understanding the more select excerpt that I'm going to discuss, and then followed by this analysis of how racial science was lectured on and discussed in medical schools. So first, I want to briefly discuss the rise of racial thinking in medical schools from 1765 to 1860. Then I will analyze how racial science was taught in the anatomy theater, the particular focus on the visual culture that made racial differences seem real. To begin with a bit of context, my book rests on 2 concurrent shifts: the rise of the theory of polygenesis and the transition away from apprenticing to school education to train physicians. The first US medical school was founded at Penn, or the University of Pennsylvania, in 1765. In the 18th century, only a handful of schools were founded, and only a few hundred MDs granted in that 35-year period. Most doctors trained as apprentices. The few schools that existed were all in the Northeast. By 1860, though, so almost 100 years after that first school was founded, there were more than 50 medical schools in the United States, spread across what's the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Midwest. Likewise, from 1840 to 1859, US medical schools granted nearly 30,000 degrees. So crux 1 of my book is that roughly in a 100-year period, a massive medical education infrastructure is created out of virtually nothing. This allows for a much more ideologically unified profession to emerge. Second, during the 19th century, racial theorists began to embrace the theory of polygenesis, culminating in the 2 decades before Darwin published his theory of natural selection in 1859. Polygenists believed that each race was created separately by God as a separate species. In the decades before the US Civil War, they usurped monogenists, their opponents in the scientific community. In the preceding centuries, monogenists maintained a near monopoly on racial theory. They believed that God created one species and differences were the product of temporary changes wrought by factors like the environment. Polygenesis, though, came into ascendancy in medical and scientific circles for 2 reasons. And it's also worth noting that as polygenists grew more popular, monogenists tended to say that these racial differences would disappear much more slowly. So their racial progressivism, to the extent that it ever existed, was heavily diluted in this period. So as slavery and racial theorists and racial status quos were under attack during this period, a theory that said Black people and Native Americans were permanent inferior species was quite convenient for whites trying to protect their slave system and genocidally expand into Native territories. Second, polygenesis's central proof was anatomical. During the first half of the 19th century, and following what was happening in Paris at the time, American physicians embraced anatomy as the cornerstone of medical education, seeing it as the most empirical discipline. This coincided with a growing sense that therapeutics like bloodletting were ineffective, or at least less effective, and many American patients began seeking out alternative sex. Anatomy, though, was innately professional and generated a sense of prestige and knowledge that was not accessible to lay people. Polygenists argued that specialized anatomical knowledge was central to defining racial difference. They relied on skull collecting and measuring to mark out racial differences. And here on the left, we can see Morton's craniometer, which he filled with seed to measure the internal cranial capacity of the skull. And on the right is the facial goniometer, which was used to measure the facial angle. And these were in medical school museums, as I'll explain later. Just as in medicine with racial science, practitioners sought anatomical methods that made their knowledge professional and outside of the hands of everyday people. For example, the United States' most famous polygenist was Samuel Morton. Worth noting, Morton was also a medical professor teaching at the Pennsylvania Medical College in Philadelphia. To create his two canonical texts, Crania Americana and Crania Egyptiaca, Morton collected more than 1,000 human crania from around the world, and he used two different tools to measure the facial angle and cranial capacity. Thus, in Morton's framework, racial expertise required medical and anatomical training, or at least this was the precedent that physicians and scientists wished to establish. Just as important to the context is that these ideas and methods for defining race were taught in US medical schools. And this is a brief excerpt from chapter 4 that I want to unpack and discuss. Racial science has a long and well-known history at Harvard, the University of Pennsylvania, and other schools, but historians have rarely focused on how it affected medical pedagogy in this early period. In his anatomy lectures at the University of Pennsylvania, Joseph Leidy taught that students had supposed racial differences in the cranium, going into depth on facial angles and cranial size. While Leidy discussed craniometry and race in his 1861 textbook, in his lectures, he provided more examples of supposed anatomical differences descending from the skull down the body. He demarcated numerous anatomical characteristics supposedly peculiar to African descendants' bodies, including narrower pelvises, longer limbs in relation to the body, longer foot, shorter toes, shorter neck, smaller and longer heel bone, and no arch in the foot. And in case it needs any reminding, obviously this is not good science based on 21st century standards. In his lectures, Leidy captured how polygenists had gone beyond just the cranium as the seat of racial difference. Instead, he depicted African descendants' bodies as diverging from whites in their totality. These small differences were negligible on their own, Leidy contended, but when combined, they defined African descendants as entirely distinct. Along with enumerating anatomical differences, lecturers employed a visual style that blended oral content with demonstration. In the introductory lecture to his first session at Harvard in 1847, Professor of Anatomy Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. plainly explained that his lectures would be highly visual. In fact, his motto was illustration. He told his students that anatomy was an inherently optical and tactile discipline, and in most respects, students learned far more from visuals than rhetoric. A professor who merely talks about that which he might show to the eye or make palpable to the touch, related Holmes, fails to give that particular subjective clearness and permanency in the student's mind of which it is susceptible. Holmes's first point on the importance of visuals to anatomical lectures focused on retention. He believed that students could understand and retain information better about the human body when it was transmitted through rhetorical, visual, and tactile instruction. Holmes argued that the second power of a visually oriented anatomical lecture resided in observation's ability to render anatomical knowledge objectively real. According to Holmes, compared to just discussing human anatomy, visuals and models made anatomy material for students. As Holmes explained, I have attempted therefore to render visible everything which the eye could take cognizance of, and so turn abstractions and catalogs of names into substantial and objective realities. Holmes used images, models, and anatomical specimens as a part of a larger pedagogical approach to anatomy. He even contacted the famed Harvard polygenicist, Louis Agassiz, for works from his private collection, And you can see how incestuous this community is just from thinking about that title page. Joseph Leidy, a professor of anatomy at Penn, Louis Agassiz. Holmes actually is quoted in the book. Holmes believed that effective anatomical instruction not only required students to memorize written or recited information about the human body, but they also had to learn human anatomy through sensory experience. The visuals that students eyed and the objects they handled gave antebellum beliefs about anatomy and race the impression of being objective realities. In an 1895 essay remembering his experiences as a student at Harvard in the 1860s, anatomy professor Oliver Wendell Holmes' eventual successor, Thomas Dwight, recalled, "One of the key features of the Harvard Medical School, from my earliest recollections, was the elaborateness of the preparations for the anatomical lectures. Not only were hours spent on the dissection itself, but every refinement of neatness and even elegance, careful draping, effective arrangement of specimens and pictures received the most careful attention." Essential to understanding Holmes's lectures about racial difference were the images that surrounded him as he explained white's supposed anatomical superiority. Most simply, when Holmes gave his lectures, he encircled himself with visual representations of racial difference that supported white anatomical supremacy. Holmes used enlarged artistic reproductions of figures from prominent polygenist texts, like Charles Pickering's The Races of Man. Most visuals in Pickering's monograph were sketches of people that he encountered during the United States exploring expeditions, circumnavigation of the globe from 1838 to 1842. Pickering also created a racial map of the world, shaded with different colors, so readers could locate the geographic homes of different racial groups. Maybe Holmes used Pickering's map, or perhaps he displayed an image of Willoughby, a native of Western Africa who was brought from Mina to Rio de Janeiro, that was featured in Pickering's book. While Holmes lectured on white supremacy, he also demonstrated it. This approach was not unique to the lecture on race, but typified Holmes' pedagogical approach to teaching anatomy generally. In 1850-51, he explicitly noted teaching the modes of examining crania to his anatomy students. Moreover, Holmes' lectures on race appeared to be similar before and after the Civil War. We could also say before and after Darwin, making it possible to guardedly use postbellum sources to consider his pedagogy in the 1850s. Notes from the 1873-74 session provided insights into the aesthetic choices underlying his pedagogy. That year, he explicitly noted using skulls and casts from the museum skulls. Almost every year in his notes, though, he delivered lectures on craniometry. In possessing Black people's preserved remains, I argue, Holmes demonstrated a type of power over African descendants and other non-white people's bodies that was germane to both anatomy's promise of mastery over dead bodies and enslaver's mastery over enslaved people. Holmes' methods were far from unique, as Southern anatomists also analyzed race and utilized visual and tactile instructional methods. In the 1840-41 Bulletin for the Medical College of South Carolina, the faculty explained that in polygenist Professor J. Edward Holbrook's anatomy lectures, constant use is made of careful and minute dissections, the excellent collection of dry and wet preparations in the museum, enlarged models of the more minute and difficult parts, a very complete mannequin of the human frame. Also, James Moultrie, the college's physiology professor, explicitly noted that he discussed racial hierarchies in his lectures. He too utilized objects from the museum for his class, perhaps displaying the college's interesting phrenological collections. Thus, I argue that through spoken content, visuals, and museum objects, anatomy professors created dynamic lectures meant to turn imagined racial differences into corporeal realities. As they lectured on racial difference, professors like Holmes, Holbrook, and Leidy surrounded themselves with racialized human remains and scientific imagery of white supremacy. So this is just one component of the larger history that I map out in Masters of Health, Racial Science and Slavery, and US Medical Schools. In many ways, it is the culmination of parts 1 and 2, as we see how racial pedagogy became nearly universal, comparatively rigorous, and standardized in medical education. As I conclude, I'll reiterate that part 1 maps out the rise of polygenesis in US medical schools in the 18th and 19th century. Through an analysis of dissection, human experimentation, and anatomical pedagogy. In part 2, I trace how the everyday practices of the medical school were deeply racialized. In an all-white, male, homosocial environment, students learned that it was normal to steal the bodies and remains of Black people, Native Americans, and poor whites. Some students in the South even conducted life-threatening experiments on enslaved people. Whether in the North or the South, though, they all gathered together to hear lectures about the inferiority of Black people. In those lectures, they stared at images meant to prove these differences that were depicted in curated visuals arranged around their professors. They even learned how to measure skulls. Finally, part 3 turns to how students were trained to look outward racially, either through practice on plantations or in how they understood the politics of a world increasingly wed together by global systems of capitalism and imperialism. In short, as well as a history of the rise of a racialized pedagogy, I end the book by arguing that the increasingly international framework that racial scientists adopted in the 1840s and 1850s helped ensure that their ideas would survive long after the abolition of slavery. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking in the Q&A about this more.
Thank you so much, Chris, for such a great paper. And I look forward to reading this book, which really brings a new perspective on the history of medical schools and the exploitation of Black bodies in dissections, even beyond life. Our third panelist is Dr. Ezel Sanford III, who is assistant professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University and visiting assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. His scholarship sits at the intersection of African American, medical, and urban histories. He's particularly interested in histories of race, science, and medicine from the 19th century to the present. He's currently working on a book project, Segregated Medicine, How Racial Politics Shaped American Healthcare, which utilizes the case of St. Louis's Homer G. Phillips Hospital, America's largest segregated hospital in the mid-20th century, to trace how the logic and legacy of racial segregation established structures of healthcare inequality that persist to this day. His work has been featured in popular and academic publications and has received several fellowships and awards. Today, he will present his forthcoming book. Thank you so much, Ezel, for your participation, and the floor is yours.
All right, can everybody hear me and see me okay?
Yes.
I believe I am unmuted. Okay. All right. Thank you, Elodie, so much for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you and Chris for inviting me to share my research at this international conference. I'm learning so much already, and I look forward to the connections that we will build here together. I should say before I get started, if you might not already be able to tell by my voice, that I am recovering from an illness that is taking me out for the majority of this week. So I'm going to do my best to speak a little bit about my project, introduce it to you all today, but please bear with me as I have a few sniffles and coughs. Let me just set my timer. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit off script today and just talk to you a little bit about my forthcoming book project, which is not under contract yet. I am feverishly working to submit my book proposal to presses right now. But the title of my forthcoming work is Segregated Medicine, How Racial Politics Shaped American Healthcare. And the ultimate goal of my book project is to answer the question that's posed in the subtitle. How have the politics of racial segregation shaped the development of American healthcare institutions? And I argue that racial segregation is actually a critical component to understanding how American healthcare has evolved, how it has developed, but also how it has shaped and impacted the distribution of healthcare resources like hospitals and the quality of those institutions. So a bit of sort of definitions right before we get started. By racial politics, I mean any political endeavor, right, that uses or turns around racial identity. And so here I'm particularly interested in how white individuals implemented racial segregation, particularly in St. Louis. But I'm also interested in how African Americans responded, how they thrived under the repressive regime of Jim Crow segregation, excuse me, and ultimately how they thrived. And I would argue that at Homer G. Phillips Hospital is really a representation of that. But in order to, sort of resist the perception that I'm advocating that racial segregation was actually a good thing, I want to sort of disentangle, right, how white people are sort of using and mobilizing racial politics and how Black people are using racial politics. And here, I'm particularly indebted to the work of Earl Lewis and George Lipschitz, among other scholars of African American history, to reframe African Americans in this period and their actions, their intellectual projects, their activism, as a form of congregation, right? That is always acting in response to the implementation of segregation, right? So as I center African Americans in my narrative and really emphasize their role here in helping to shape, again, the distribution of healthcare resources in the American healthcare system, that itself is sort of distinct from, but reacting to racial segregation writ large in the Jim Crow era, right? So white people are sort of advancing a kind of segregation racial politics, while African Americans are advancing a type of congregation racial politics. Excuse me. And I want to begin, before I go into the book's outline, by talking a little bit about 2020 and how it sort of created a moment where we were not only sort of dealing with a racial reckoning here in the United States, particularly with the violent police-involved murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but also with the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has overlaid on social inequities that really, date back to the history of racial segregation. And this, occurred a year after I completed my dissertation at Princeton University, and it really prompted me to think, more deeply about the continuities of inequity in our healthcare system, and to ask, well, if American healthcare desegregated in the 1960s, then why is health equity still an unresolved goal here in the United States? And I was sort of shocked to see some of the stories that were emerging during this pandemic, that African Americans themselves were being refused admission to hospitals in order to receive treatment for COVID-19. Of course, we know that COVID-19 has significantly impacted, excuse me, communities of color in the United States. In addition to the questions about access to healthcare institutions, right, that there were other stories that were emerging about how African Americans were treated, right, in these now integrated hospitals. And there's this case of Dr. Susan Moore, who was an African American physician who ultimately died from complications due to COVID-19, but who shared her inequitable experiences in the hospital as an African American physician on social media. And it really prompted people to ask the question, well, if someone who is intimately familiar with healthcare and the provision of medical services, they could be treated in this way, then how are regular lay people, lay African Americans being treated in healthcare facilities? And these episodes, I should mention also that there was a striking case in St. Louis where a 30-something African American man was denied admission to Barnes Jewish Hospital, the teaching hospital associated with Washington University. He was denied admission to that hospital 3 times and ended up dying in that hospital's parking lot. How can that be, right? And in my mind, as a historian who is really focused on the history of racial segregation, it harkened back to other prominent cases, really, where African Americans in the Jim Crow era, in the period of racial segregation, legalized racial segregation in the United States, that African Americans faced similar kinds of issues in terms of accessing segregated hospital facilities. And on the left here is a picture of a pamphlet titled The Untouchables, excuse me, that was produced in 1952 by Albert Manu, which collected many of these stories in a hope of making a powerful case that hospitals needed to be desegregated. One of those cases was that of Juliet Derricotte, who was the Dean of Women at Fisk University, who died in 1931 after being involved in a fatal car crash. She was riding with a few of her students, many of whom were also injured, one of whom also died. And she was taken to a makeshift colored ward, that is a health institution that was designated to treat African Americans. This, of course, was not a hospital. It was actually a home in which an African American woman sort of treated emergency cases. Derricotte was taken there and ultimately died, even though there was a white hospital with empty beds not far away from that colored ward. The case of Juliet Derricotte was a really prominent case, in part because of her role as a race woman, right? So this was reported across the nation to African Americans and really highlighted again the fatal perils of segregated medicine. The case of Charles Drew is another example. In this case, Drew was rumored to have died after being denied admission to a white hospital. Drew, of course, was a blood storage pioneer, really making blood banking technologies possible. And he was involved in a fatal car accident in North Carolina in 1950. It was rumored that he was denied access to a white hospital, as Spency Love, the historian Spency Love, has outlined in her book One Blood. Those rumors were untrue, right? Drew was actually admitted to the white hospital and was treated, but still ultimately succumbed to his injuries. But nonetheless, the rumors sort of speak to a larger truth, right? It spoke to a larger truth that African Americans really were in dire trouble, particularly if they were in the South and needed access to hospital facilities. And so my work, again, traces the history of segregation and its importance in the development of American healthcare. And I resist the urge to tell a more national, a broader national story, or to tell a comparative story, because there's so many variables that a historian has to be attuned to, particularly with the history of hospitals. But I've decided instead to employ a micro-historical approach and to focus on one particular institution. And that is Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which operated from 1937 to 1979. It emerged as one of the largest general hospitals in the United States, as well as perhaps the largest segregated hospital for African Americans. And what I argue in the book is that this hospital is really sort of a manifestation of that kind of congregation racial politics. That is, that African Americans had to turn inward and to act pragmatically in order to achieve political ends. And in this case, the political concession of a fully separate hospital facility that was operated by the city of St. Louis, but really sort of run and administered and operated by African Americans. And so I trace these larger transitions from racial segregation to desegregation at the national level on the ground at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, while also analyzing its sort of operation within a municipal health network, its operation with the local private white hospitals and the medical schools, but also place it within a larger national network of institutions that were run by African Americans for African Americans as a response to racial segregation. And this also gives me an opportunity to really center the stories of African Americans who were operating on the ground, to really give us a sense of how they interacted with these broader national transitions. So the book is separated into 3 parts, and I'm going to walk through those with you now. So part 1, Embracing Segregation, describes how the city of St. Louis began to implement an uneven system of racial segregation across its various sectors, from housing to transportation to schooling. And that really is a response from white St. Louisans, particularly white immigrant St. Louisans who have recently immigrated from Europe, who are responding to another group of migrants. And those are individuals from the Great Migration. And I follow one figure in particular in chapter 1, and that is, his name is Homer G. Phillips, attorney Homer G. Phillips, who migrated from Sedalia, Missouri, to St. Louis in the 19-teens. He became a prominent civil rights lawyer, but also a staunch anti-segregationist. He was involved in representing African American victims of the 1917 East St. Louis race riot, and becomes a key sort of elite figure in St. Louis municipal politics. And he is ultimately assassinated publicly while waiting on the streetcar in 1931, and has what is reportedly one of the largest funerals in the city's history. And so again, before I can meditate on the implementation of segregation in the medical sphere, I focus on the history of segregation and shaping the urban environment in St. Louis. And I focus particularly on the 1916 segregation ordinances, which would have enshrined into city law housing residency segregation in the city. These ordinances are a part of a national movement to implement racial segregation, particularly in border states. There's a similar move in Baltimore, Maryland. Ultimately, these ordinances are challenged in the United States Supreme Court, and with the case Buchanan v. Worley, and ultimately they're deemed unenforceable. Right, so these segregation ordinances that were promoted by local citizens are ultimately deemed to be unenforceable. But yet there are informal practices of racial segregation that are then embraced in order to keep African Americans and white St. Louisans separated, but also to preserve white supremacy and white dominance. And one way in which racial segregation was informally produced was with the use of race restrictive housing deeds. And so this really concentrates African Americans in particular portions of the city. And this becomes important when African Americans begin to demand their own separate hospital. So St. Louis in the early 20th century maintained 2 city hospitals. On the left is City Hospital number 1, which opened in the late 19th century, which was for white patients. It did have quote unquote colored wards. And then the city also maintained City Hospital number 2. Of course, these numbers themselves are indicative, right, of the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy in the city of St. Louis. African Americans, of course, being subjugated, right, second-class citizens. And City Hospital number 2 was established in the 50-year-old Barnes Medical College. This is where Barnes Jewish Hospital was located before it moved closer to Washington University to become its affiliated teaching hospital. So this institution was already 50 years old when it opened for African Americans in 1919. And it was deemed a fire trap, right? So, and you can see on the right here how close the beds were African Americans could not use the second and third floors because there was simply no way to escape the building if it burned down. But Black doctors also began to protest City Hospital number 2 because they couldn't practice, right? White city physicians, excuse me, practiced in City Hospital number 1. And so they began to mobilize a movement to get the city to build a completely new hospital. And the city initially decided to build a colored annex adjacent to City Hospital number 1. Elite African Americans, including Black physicians, resisted that kind of medical segregation. And attorney Homer G. Phillips calls it segregation with humiliation, right? So even as elite African Americans are working with the city to achieve certain political concessions, you see how they're operating in pragmatic ways, right? And this is demonstrated by this fictional account, this undated fictional account by a representative of the League of Women Voters, Fannie Cook, who was writing about some of the debates between elite African Americans and white municipal leaders on what kind of segregation they're going to have, right? And we see Fannie Cook arguing that, well, if you white people, white municipal leaders are going to be, are going to insist, right, that we must be segregated, right, then what you need to do is to use your money to build us a completely separate facility somewhere else so that Black physicians can train and work autonomously, and so that African Americans won't have to be reduced to some of the indignities, right, that they have experienced in accessing white hospitals, and particularly colored wards, so sections within a hospital that were designated for African American healthcare. And so here again, I am interested in the urban history and history of medicine connections in terms of the history of racial segregation. And on the left here, we have a map of the segregated or unrestricted areas in which African Americans could live. Of course, again, this was maintained in part by a system of race restrictive covenants and housing deeds. In the middle block here, you see what was known as Mill Creek Valley, which was a prominent African American settlement next to the city's industries. Of course, it runs right to the Mississippi River, but it was also full of tenements, very unhealthy in terms of where waste was disposed, access to clean water, etc. But it was raised in the 1950s due to one of the largest urban renewal projects in the United States. And the Black Bloc a little further north and east is the Ville and Greaterville neighborhoods, which was an area where Black elites settled in the mid-20th. Oh, okay. My timer has just gone off. But where African Americans have settled in the mid-20th century, and that's where the hospital is ultimately placed. And again, you see this is the historic Ville neighborhood. The picture on the left is a photo from Colin Gordon's Mapping Decline, where he maps the history of segregation in St. Louis. The hospital opens in 1937. The National Medical Association, the African American analog to the American Medical Association, meets there, establishing the hospital's prominence not only as a local institution, but a national institution. But at the same time, there are these sort of tensions in terms of how racial segregation is being made sense of by African Americans. And here you see a quote from attorney David Grant, who was a protege of attorney Homer G. Phillips, who basically says, would Homer G. Phillips have accepted his name as a opponent of racial segregation? Would he have accepted his name being placed on one of the largest segregated facilities in the United States? Yeah. And I'm just going to fast forward here. and get to my ending. Okay, so the 1960s is a key point of transition, but also of continuity for me as Black physicians and health activists engage in a medical civil rights movement. And in rapid succession, private hospitals by Supreme Court case, Simpkins v. Moses Cone, outlaws racial segregation in private hospital facilities. But there's also a major economic transition that's happening in American healthcare, really at the same time as the Johnson administration passes Medicare and Medicaid legislation, changing how healthcare is financed, but also opening the door to more third parties being involved in the distribution of health services. And ultimately, what I argue is that though the medical civil rights movement was successful in desegregating American hospitals, it didn't ultimately achieve this goal of health equity. I argue in part because Black hospitals themselves began to close down, either because they were relics of the segregated era or because they can't sort of survive in this new kind of economic context. But there's there's something else that's going on as well, and that's that segregation becomes impractical. It becomes expensive, as you see here from a report from the city of St. Louis. They can no longer duplicate services, right? And the city ultimately wants to get out of the hospital business. But African Americans resist, and you have to ask yourself why. And what I find really important is that these individuals want to save the hospital, not because it's a relic of segregation, but that it still has an enduring need right now, or at least in the 1970s when it was closed. And these individuals ask the city government not only to keep this hospital open, but to build more public hospital facilities, right? So these African Americans are saying that we don't want the privatized healthcare that we see coming into focus here, but instead we want the government, the people who are responsible to us as taxpayers and as voters, to open and manage more hospitals so that we have more access to care, not less. And that's exactly what was happening in the post-civil rights era and in the American healthcare system, as my colleague George Almoth is working on it right now, where they're sort of implementing a policy of medical scarcity, right? And by reducing the number of hospital beds and closing hospital facilities. And the day that the hospital closed, it was met with much outrage, but also much sort of police enforcement. And I'm not going to play a clip from my oral history with Mary Tillman. So I'm going to. And again, you see how African Americans viewed the closure of this particular hospital. And I think I'm going to leave it there. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Isel, for this great paper. And I learned so much about the history of St. Louis, but also I think your work is fascinating because it provides a link with this local history and the broader history of segregation and persistence of inequalities in healthcare. And I have so many questions, so I'll keep them for the Q&A. So I would like to now I would like to introduce our respondent for this panel, Nathalie Descendants. Thank you very much, Nathalie, for accepting to participate in the symposium. Nathalie Descendants is a professor of American history and civilization, at the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès. Her research bears on American plantation societies, especially 19th century Louisiana, and on the memorialization of slavery. She has co-edited many books in French, such as Haïti, Regard Croisé in 2007, La Louisiane au carrefour des cultures, 2016, and Regard Croisé sur la post-racialité aux États-Unis, 2021. She has co-authored with Richard Marin, Les mots de l'esclavage, 2021. She has also authored books in English, such as Myth of the Plantation Society, Slavery in the American South and the West Indies, in 2003, From Saint-Domingue to New Orleans, Migration and Influences, 2007, and Creole City, A Chronicle of Early American New Orleans, in 2015, all published with University Press of Florida. After editing French colonial history for 3 years, she became vice president and president of the French Colonial Historical Society. She's currently finishing a book co-authored with Virginia Gould, tentatively entitled The Keys to the Big House, a Creole Plantation in the Atlantic World. So thank you so much, Nathalie, for these comments, and the floor is yours for 5-10 minutes.
Okay, it's more 10 minutes, but
Perfect.
So I first want to thank Elodie and Christopher for inviting me to this symposium and giving me the opportunity to become more familiar with this very productive new field of research. I also thank you for these 3 fascinating papers, which make me look forward to the completion of your books. They will be wonderful additions to the historiography of the relationships between race and medicine, and to a better understanding of the persisting inequalities in the medical system in the United States. This issue is indeed still extremely topical in the context of the current pandemic, which has revealed deep fractures between social and racial groups in terms of morbidity and mortality, and particularly in the American South. The 3 presentations aptly complement each other in helping us better understand racialized medicine in the US context from its early professionalization in the late 18th century to the present, to the Affordable Care Act, and of course to COVID-19. Although maybe, if I have a first comment to make, starting with Christopher's presentation might have set the contextual framework in which the other 2 papers fit, as it really serves as a matrix to understanding the further evolutions described by Elodie and Ezel. The racialization of medicine is not new in the US, and we all remember how in the early 1780s already, Thomas Jefferson, although he had no clear position on the debate between monogenism and polygenism, advanced as a suspicion only, as he wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia, that Blacks were, I quote, inferior to the whites in endowments of body and mind, unquote. Expatiating on their physical differences, on whether their color resides, I quote him, in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of other secretions, unquote, stating that their pulmonary apparatus had a different structure. He already used the lexicon of anatomy, paving the way for later scientific theories. The long debate over the issue of slavery that shook the 19th century only fortified these first bases. The heated debates over polygenism, the medical experiments forced upon enslaved people, the treatise of craniology, Knott's and Morton's theories have been analyzed at length in the historiography. The book projects presented by Elodie, Christopher, and Ezel are groundbreaking additions to this historiography because they proceed to give deep insights into more rarely addressed questions: the transmission of medical knowledge in white supremacist context, the racialized diagnosis and treatment of mental diseases, and medical segregation and desegregation, or maybe rather resegregation in a new form in the 20th century. Christopher's book project opens an extraordinary window into an unexplored set of sources. While elite theorists are rather well known by specialists of 19th century pro-slavery ideology, by studying an impressive number of medical dissertations, Christopher gives a key to understanding how the transmission of racialized medical theories to the next generations of medical students ingrained racialist theories in the American medical profession members long after it became useless to invoke racial differences to vindicate slavery. The study of pedagogical material, syllabi, anatomy lectures, and medical school bulletins reveals how medical white supremacy was transmitted to medical students, who then became figures of authority to their patients and surrounding society, thus disseminating the theories they had been taught. Elodie's study shows how deeply implanted racial stereotypes were, and her study of how the tasks assigned to the various racial and gender groups were distributed perfectly shows how, from plantation slavery to psychiatric hospitals to chain gangs, Black males were always considered as only apt to perform hard agricultural labor or earthwork. The introduction is particularly intriguing with the two categories of diseases of the nervous system mentioned, political excitement and religious excitement. Also fascinating is the thesis echoing what Christopher's argument also demonstrates, that white physicians, and I quote you, Elodie, using their scientific authority and public visibility, were simultaneously politicizing medical theories and medicalizing political divides. As in the case of Christopher's presentation, Elodie's research is based on an extraordinary variety of new sources, personal writings of physicians, annual reports of institutions, memoirs, and photographs, among others, which enable her to shape novel theories on scientific racialization in the US. Ezel's study is also very novel in that it is a micro-historical study of one specific hospital, which by being painstakingly contextualized, shows how intrinsically connected the local and national levels are. He shows how racial politics shaped the development and evolution of the American healthcare system by studying both the policies and practices of racial segregation, but also, maybe less expectedly, African Americans' adaptations to it. By also connecting the medical questions to economic factors, he shows how the disappearance of segregated medicine in the 1950s and 60s maintained what he calls entrenched racial inequities. And the term entrenched here is important and echoes with both Christopher's and Elodie's research. Through a questioning that is similar to Elodie's and Christopher's, he demonstrates the persistence of racialization of medicine and of unequal medical treatment of Blacks, and how it was shaped by and in turn shaped American healthcare over the long duration, with effects still largely perceptible today, as he showed very efficiently. All in all, what these three presentations and forthcoming books reveal is, first of all, the number of original sources that can be summoned to bring hindsight to the history of race relations in the US. They help understand the various ways in which racialized visions became so deeply ingrained in the American psyche that they have failed to abate in the 50 years since the Civil Rights Movement. Through medical transmission, through politicization of medical diagnosis and treatments, through institutionally and politically organized structuration, the US has fossilized a strongly racialized perception of society. I have a few comments and questions I would like to add, which might launch the general discussion. I think that all of them are issues that will be addressed in the books. So my questions and remarks are by no means critical, since I'm well aware that the formats of today's presentations did not allow such detailed considerations. But I thought they might help us better understand the connections between the three papers and the conclusions that we may draw from them. I would be interested in hearing more from Christopher about the association of dissecting rooms and slave markets as homosocial spaces. I would also like to hear about the methodology used to study the medical students' dissertations. And I would like to have a better sense of the proportion of echoes to racial signs they contain, as well as of the differences between North and South, if any. I also wonder about the training of Black doctors. And I'm here thinking of Louis-Charles Roudanet, whom Elodie quoted, a Louisiana racially mixed doctor who, after being granted a doctorate in medicine from La Sorbonne in 1853, was also granted a medical degree from Dartmouth College in 1857. And as I was checking the date, because I wasn't sure anymore, I looked at the list of African-American medical graduates from Dartmouth College between 1775 and 1865, and I found 22 names, which of course might seem anecdotal, but is not negligible. And this led me to wondering if they were also taught racial science, which of course might lead us to wonder about their reception of these racialized theories. In Elodie's study as presented today, I felt that there was a slight tendency towards essentialization because the racial groups were treated as undifferentiated. And again, I'm sure it's in the book, but it would be helpful to better understand a certain number of things to better grasp what was presented today. And my questions here are how and by whom the patients were committed, if the diagnosis between Blacks and Whites were different, if the Blacks' commitment was made necessary by real psychological ailments, or if, as the opening lines suggest, it was a means to control Black resistance. From the voicing of Black protest against what was felt as re-enslavement, we get the impression that the patients had enough reason to associate the plantationary context of the psychiatric hospital with their former environment as enslaved people, which is why I would have been interested in knowing more about the reasons for their presence and the whites' presence in these hospitals. I'm also curious about the sources which reveal the voices of the Black patients, and in particular, how many direct, unmediated testimonies there were, like transcripts of discussions between patients and doctors in the medical files, like the one you quoted, or if the Black voices were heard mostly through the mediation of the physicians and hospital administrations. In the same way, I have many questions about Ezel's study. And here again, most probably they're also linked with the format of today's presentation. I wonder who the medical staff were at Homer Phillips Hospital and where they were trained. And maybe in the light of Christopher's paper, I'm curious to know how the training of Black doctors addressed racialized medicine in the context of segregated medical education. I'm thinking that comparing the pedagogical material used on both sides of the color line might yield extraordinary results. Although this is probably not in the scope of the book, it seems to me that it would add much to the knowledge of how segregated medicine thrived and how it further deepened the gap between the various racial groups, their access to equal medical treatment, and the persistence of racial stereotypes in medicine, but of course, also more largely in society. So in conclusion, I would like to thank you again for these wonderful presentations, and I do look forward to the general discussion and of course to reading your books.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, for these comments. Perhaps we can switch on our video cameras for the Q&A. Perhaps either Chris or Ezel want to start answering some of those questions that Nathalie just asked.
Yeah, really quickly, I just want to say that I'm trying to start my camera and it says that there's an error, so I do apologize, but I will continue with my voice. I'm not sure why my camera is not working.
Perhaps you want to start, Ezel, or?
Yeah. Natalie, thank you so much for that wonderful synthesis of all of our papers. And of course, there are many through lines between Chris's work, Elodie's work, and my own. I do want to address the question about racial segregation and the training of both Black doctors and white doctors, which is a subject of one of my chapters in part 2, which is Enduring Racial Segregation. So I neglected to mention it in my presentation because of the brevity of the talk, that one of the reasons why Homer G. Phillips becomes such an important institution nationally is because it's one of the few segregated hospitals that's large enough to actually adhere to the standards set by residency programs in order to host residency programs. So Homer G. Phillips becomes itself a prominent training ground for African American medical specialists in the Jim Crow era. But there is a distinction, right? And I see this particularly when comparing and tracing the movement of both Black and white physicians in and out of the hospital itself, but also the movement of white physicians in and around Barnes Jewish Hospital, which is again the affiliated teaching hospital of Washington University. And those physicians also advise the residency programs in surgery and other medical specialties at Homer G. Phillips. And one of the key distinctions is really the patients and the kinds of diseases in which they find themselves in the hospital between Barnes Jewish and Homer G. What you find at Homer G is that many African Americans arrive at the hospital in a later course of disease. They come with more sort of general illnesses as compared to Barnes Jewish, which upon its opening, the physicians who are involved in teaching the white medical students there are really concerned that the hospital already is becoming too specialized, right? And that's limiting the number of cases, is limiting the exposure of the white physicians that are being trained in Barnes Jewish Hospital. And so what they do is actually to begin to rotate through the teaching hospital at Homer G. Phillips. And so I haven't compared the sort of the pedagogical curricula of these programs, in part because they're at least at Homer G. Phillips, which is a source problem, that many of the hospital's internal records have actually been destroyed, right? So some of these things I actually can't get to other than through kind of secondary accounts from those who were actually trained in the institution. But there is a distinction, right? And we see sort of how segregation is shaping not only the specialty training of African American physicians, but also the specialty training of white physicians in St. Louis. And I'll leave it there.
Great.
Well, I could jump in. I wanted to thank Natalie for her great questions and comments. Also, so I wanted to start maybe piggybacking off Azelle about Black medical training. And it's actually bringing up Dartmouth does draw out another portion of my book, but also brings something that I was actually putting together while you were talking, something I hadn't thought of. But so in my chapter that precedes what I kind of focused on today about body snatching, I talk about the first Black medical graduate, Samuel F. McGill, who graduates from Dartmouth in 1839. And one of the interesting anecdotes is how McGill is forced to kind of reproduce a white supremacist medical student culture. As admission into Dartmouth's medical school, he actually has to import 2 bodies for the dissection room from Baltimore, almost certainly of Black people, probably enslaved people. So a part of his admission into medical school is enslaved people's cadavers. And McGill actually crosses over with Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes teaches at Dartmouth Medical School for 2 years. And so I think we can be pretty confident that he was learning racial science. And there's an interesting anecdote also about Holmes and Black students at Harvard in the 1850-51 session, that session where I mentioned where we know explicitly that Holmes taught students to measure crania. That also was the year where Harvard did an ultimately aborted attempt at desegregating. They admitted 3 Black students on the condition that they'd practice in Liberia after graduating. And the white students revolt, essentially, or half of them do. Half of them are fine with it, to give credit to those who aren't so racist as to be able to sit into a segregated medical school classroom because it was segregated. But half of them threatened to leave. And in that year, Holmes actually escalates his racial science lectures. Most years in the records, we see 1 lecture on racial science. That year, he gives 3. So I think it's a pretty fair to say that at least most of the time, these Black students would have been learning racialized ideas of difference. And I think that would have been true of those who actually went and studied in Europe as well. And then, so the biggest difference I found for the North and the South, really the only difference that I zero in on, is I found a couple of really disturbing experiments on enslaved people that are for non-therapeutic reasons. It's not like J. Marion Sims trying to perfect a surgery. These are largely just kind of philosophical, physiological questions about how the body works. And that use of Black people's bodies in a way that was willing to essentially kill them for just a medical student dissertation, I never saw that in any of the Northern institutions. That only happened in my findings at the Medical University of South Carolina. And then one final thing, I think that the way that I happened to be early in grad school, I was reading Walter Johnson's Soul by Soul and Michael Sapple's A Traffic of Dead Bodies, as well as works like John Hurley Warner's great works of therapeutic perspective and Against the Spirit of the System. And what I was thinking about a lot in that time period was that the slave pen does not admit women. It's an all-white male space where they peer around and analyze bodies. The dissection room is largely a place that excludes women, and it's a place where only white men are allowed to analyze bodies. So you have these actually in artistic reproductions, just kind of crowds of men huddled around a body in both contexts at the time. And so in my opinion, that I argue, and this kind of comparison between unpacking the Paris clinic experience that students learned about, and to see, to study race or disease on the inside of people's bodies, is this transition towards looking at race on the inside of bodies from skull measurements, internal capacity, rather than just a kind of aesthetic outward appearance. And I want to make sure we have time for any questions in the Q&A. So I'll hand it over to Elodie, but thank you so much for those great questions.
Thank you. So to answer some of Natalie's comments, so when I mentioned those categories that physicians used to classify Black patients in Southern hospitals starting in the 1870s, especially categories such as the mulatto category or the American Blacks category that they used, those were categories that obviously essentialized Black bodies in a way that physicians, try to really create a link between the so-called nature of these bodies and the epidemiologies that those bodies could be affected by. You also asked a question about the patient's resistance. And to me, that was very interesting, when I first looked at those archives, because I didn't really expect to find any testimonies, direct testimonies, unmediated testimonies by patients, because most of the records you find in archives of segregated hospitals or Black hospitals are physicians' reports, really, or minutes of the board, which in the 19th century were, written by white physicians, men. And so the way I started thinking of this question of resistance was to try to find traces of, everyday resistances. So either letters. So I started looking at Civil Rights Association later on, Civil Rights Association archives, because sometimes you actually find letters written by patients or by their family members about their experiences. So that's an interesting thing that historians of medicine can look at. But I've also, and I didn't include this example in my presentation, but there was one case of a Black patient who was in the Goldsboro Hospital in North Carolina, and he tried to escape. And you only have 2 or 3 lines about this story of his escape in the report. And so here the way I tried to integrate this narrative into my book was to explain how this escape was, a form of everyday resistance that this patient might have tried to create in order to escape the medical apparatus, to try to get out of the institution in this way. But yes, you're right to point out the fact that this is a very this is something very tricky to do, and I think one of the comments in the chat box mentioned that the fact that obviously Black voices were historically silenced, and that it's our job as historians to obviously try to make sure they are part of the narrative as well. And I'll stop here because I don't want to talk too much. And I think in the Q&A box, we do have a question by Derek Gaydon. So I'm going to read this question. While discussing the difference in pedagogy, could it be assumed that Black doctors would have needed to not speak their beliefs as a condition of completing their medical degrees? It is hard to believe they would have been encouraged to display any contention they had with teaching they disagreed with. So I don't know, it's probably a question for Isel, because your work, Isel, has tackled the topic of the professionalization of Black doctors in the US.
Yeah,
but
I'm sorry.
maybe, yeah.
Could you repeat that just one more time for me?
Yes. While discussing the difference in pedagogy, could it be assumed that Black doctors would have needed to not speak their beliefs as a condition of completing their medical degrees?
Yeah. So again, the kind of professionalization that I focus on is post graduate medical education, right? So the folks that I'm looking at in the space of Homer G. Phillips already have their medical degrees, and in fact are attempting to attain board certification in their various specialties. I think it's a complicated question, though, right? I mean, if we are sort of thinking about African Americans in medical institutions and what kinds of agency they do have, and not only sort of how they experience medical school, particularly for those who were admitted to white medical schools, but also how what they were being taught sort of aligns with their own, sort of perspectives as African Americans. And I think Chris obviously could speak more to this as well. But again, I'm looking at folks who are already in African American spaces, right? So in many ways, they're already around individuals who have gone through these processes. Who are engaged in thinking critically about their Black patients, and in some cases are also problematic, right? I mean, this is one of the tensions that I try to expose, even in my own work, between the African American doctors who are practicing at Homer G. Phillips, and the people who they're practicing upon, right? That these doctors are themselves, middle class, if not elite, individuals that. Some of the pervasive racial ideologies that are taught, as Chris demonstrated, and you did as well, Elodie, they're so pervasive that even some of these doctors themselves, may not ascribe to all of it, right? But it certainly becomes a part of their practice as doctors. And there's one case that I pull upon that I think really sort of draws this out, and that's the treatment of Dick Gregory, who was a prominent African American comedian who. For much of his career, despised Homer G. Phillips as an African American, as a Black St. Louisan, right? And who referenced in his early biographies about his inequitable treatment and how the doctors saw not only him but his family, right? And so I think it's important for us to meditate on how racial ideologies were embedded into medical pedagogy, and how African American doctors were complicit in it, but also resistant to it, right? Because I think it's a mixture of both. But Chris, please correct me if you see something different.
No, I would echo what you're saying in my same period. So I think you have both resistance and echoing. So take the case of James McKean Smith, the first American or Black African American doctor or to get an MD, but he gets it in Edinburgh. And he comes back to the US, and he's certainly not a silent, transmitter of racial ideas, but he also does reproduce them at various times. He's in a lot of in various times in freedom suits will act as an expert witness and reproduce some of these racial scientific ideas in an effort to actually prove people's either whiteness to get them out of slavery or Blackness. And another case would be Martin Delaney, who is one of those 3 students at Harvard who attends for that partial year. He already had become a doctor through apprenticing. And in the 1870s, and I deal with this in my epilogue, he writes a anti-racial science text. And he basically says polygenesis is a load of crap. But then he also advocates against racial mixing because he's very, for understandable reasons, prejudiced against white people. I don't know if prejudice is the right term, but on a kind of core level, on a racialized level, he is looking at racial groups even as he dismisses polygenesis in certain ways. So I think you see both a reaction against it, of course, and but also at times reproduction of these ideas because they get the full weight of medical authority. And so if you're a trained doctor, some of that authority is going to bleed into you a little bit, or at least some of that notion that these are accurate ideas will bleed over.
Great. So we have 2 questions, and I think those will be the final questions for this panel. And actually, those 2 questions go in the same direction. So one question by Habib Amoussa about the evolution of the situation today. What's pretty much happened after the 1960s? Are there any ways in which we can connect our own works with the current situation today? And another question from Monica Perkins about contemporary medical school faculty often pushing back on integrating the history of race and racism in medicine in their curriculum. And so the question is, what are your thoughts on integrating your work within contemporary medical school curricula? So maybe we can start with Chris, because your work deals with the history of those medical schools. And what I really find interesting in your work is the fact that you talk about these figures, these professors that are sometimes even talked about in a very positive light. Today, I was thinking of J. Marion Sims, who is often mentioned as the father of gynecology, and this is also something that historian Deirdre Cooper Owens mentions in her own work. So I would guess this is a question for you, and then maybe Isel can jump in, and I'll try to say a few words about psychiatry.
Yeah, so I think I definitely agree, Monica, that this needs to be in medical schools, and it's something that one of my next steps in my career is a goal to make a pedagogy that can be both public facing and medical education facing, because you hope, and getting to the echoes, I end the book with the 2017 or 2016 study of UVA medical students and residents, where it turns out they believe a lot of these really ridiculous racial ideas that emerge in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Black people have thicker skin, they're insensitive to pain. And these are medical students and even some people who have already graduated from medical school. So while maybe it's a naive hope, but that maybe if somebody realized that they were reproducing the ideas of Malpaghi, blistering Black people's skin in the 1690 or so, not exact date, maybe they'd think that's problematic, or that Black women, I'm thinking about Sasha Turner's great work, Contested Bodies, Black women, or West African women have a culture of not trying not to express pain during childbirth. And this is an era when these ideas of Black people being insensitive to pain are emerging. Not that that's just white doctors observing real things, and they're of course putting their own spins and justifications, but these emerge in the context of the plantation, in a context of wanting to work people to death, and that maybe, and sometimes I feel incredibly naive for thinking this, if they understood where these ideas came from, that they would want to disband, stop using race as a concept in medical practice. So I do think that just taking a clinical ethics perspective, which is where to any extent we get this in medical education, really loses the really disturbing origin points of these ideas. And that maybe, I just have to keep saying maybe because I don't want to be shocked when I'm wrong. Maybe they'll listen if they learn the history a little bit.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that, Chris. You know, in our sort of previous relationship as sort of fellows in with the program on Race, Science, and Society, directed by the wonderful Dorothy Roberts at the University of Pennsylvania, where we've had some of these discussions, and I've spoken with medical students not only there but in other institutions across the United States, and I have really sort of picked up on this point as well, that medical students need to understand this history, right? And I think the work of the panelists, in this panel right now, but also the work of the panelists for the next panel demonstrates to us, right? Not only the origin points, right, but the sort of the contingencies of how race becomes so important and so deeply enmeshed, not only within medical education, but also the dissemination of medical knowledge and the development of medical practices, right? And so, when I talk to medical students and they ask me, well, what can we use, right? If we, should have used these sort of these biological notions of racial difference, and I'll just caveat here and say that there are, sort of real world sort of social implications of racialized life, right, that do contribute to racial health disparities, right? But that there's not, biological differences between the racial groups. And so when they ask me that, I say, well, go read the work, right? If you read the histories, you do become familiar with the disturbing origin points of racist ideologies that are embedded in medicine, but also how they continue to propagate even to today. You can still find evidence of this in current day medical journals, right? And I think that, as Chris said, that we have to sort of depart from kind of the ethical perspective here and really talk about the historical, and really begin to understand sort of where this troubled relationship comes from, in order for us to really sort of figure out, well, how do we rectify it, right? And I think it's going to take some time and some imagination and some exploration, but also some education in terms of how we really instill ideals of equity and justice in future generations of medical practitioners.
Thank you, Rizal. I just want to jump in following those comments. Maybe I can talk a little bit more about the situation in France. In France, there has been some works, tackling the fact that the notion of race is still used in the medical field today. But those recent works often talk about the return of this notion of race as a biological notion, which is obviously problematic. And I think what we see in all those papers today is the fact that there hasn't been a return, because it has always been there. And it's still, there are still continuities, really. So we shouldn't talk about a return, but we should talk about the continuities, the legacies. And another thing I want to address is the fact that in psychiatry in the US, there has been, starting in the 1970s and 1980s, there has been, the development of cultural competency programs. And these are, in some ways, these are problematic. And this is something that historian and psychiatrist Jonathan Melzo addressed in his book, the protest psychosis, because in one way, those programs really essentialize the notion of culture. Having one program about how to treat Latino patients specifically, or African-American patients. And so culture becomes the new notion being used, but in a way, it's also a notion that is essentialized by psychiatrists. And so I came across actually training programs in schools, in medical schools in UCLA and UCSF, using the word cultural humility, and that was, to me, that was an interesting notion. Instead of talking about cultural competency, talking about cultural humility, the idea that a psychiatrist should take into account the person's culture, but also, and more importantly, what the person talks about, not necessarily using fixed ideas or fixed notions to analyze the individual's case. So that's just one of maybe more, I would say, progressive or interesting frame that physicians or psychiatrists can use today. But there are still a lot of work to do. There is still a lot of work to do to improve the situation, obviously. So I want to thank Chris, Isel, and Natalie for those insightful comments. Perhaps we can take a 10 minutes break, because it's already 5:50, and so we can resume panel 2 in 10 minutes or so. That sounds good. So thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to welcome everybody to panel 2 of this exciting Zoom symposium, Legacies of Slavery, Racism, and Empire in the History of Medicine. My name is Chris Willoughby, as you probably know if you were here for the first panel, and I'm really excited to be co-hosting this with Elodie Edwards-Grossi. We'd like to really quickly, before we start, reiterate our thanks to our sponsors. The University of Chicago Center in Paris has been great in managing this online event, especially as we transition, and the Lab CIS at the Université Toulouse, Jean Jarre, which has supported the event from the very start, and we're really grateful to have them. So this is panel 2 on medical racism and empire. Like the first panel, just in case you came in or just enjoy hearing similar information twice, we'll have a joint Q&A session at the end of each panel after the respondents' comments. So please prepare your questions in the chat box for the Q&A, and we'll engage with them later on. And you should also feel free to put your questions in the chat box as you have them, if you like. I mean, you can also wait till the end, but if something strikes you in the middle of a talk, feel free to throw it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it at the end for our group session. And we also regret that one of our participants in panel 2, Raphael Galin, had unfortunately to drop out. So it's just going to be our really great scholars, Rana Hogarth and Delphine Peretti-Cortez. So with that, I'm going to start by introducing our first panelists, and then in case people need it, I'll be introducing people before each person speaks. So we'll start with Rana Hogarth, then I'll show back up again to introduce our second speaker. Rana Hogarth is Associate Professor of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on the creation of ideas about racial difference in North America and the Caribbean as they emerge through the language of medicine and its allied fields. She is the author of Medicalizing Blackness, Making Racial Difference in the Atlantic World, 1780 to 1840, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017. It examines how white physicians define Blackness as a medically significant marker of difference in slave societies of the American Atlantic. I think it's safe to say it's already become essential reading for historians of medicine and slavery, and that's me. She didn't put that in her own bio. It'd be a bit egotistical. Her publications appear in History Compass, Social History of Medicine, American Quarterly, African and Black Diaspora and International Journal, the American Journal of Public Health, and I'm really proud to say in the edited volume, Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, which I edited with Sean Maury Smith, and was published by Louisiana State University Press this week. So with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Rana to present on her new book project, which I'm sure is going to wow us all when it comes out, called Measuring Miscegenation, Eugenics, Anti-Blackness, and the Legacies of Slavery. So with that, I give the floor to Rana. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Especially thank you to Chris and Elodie for organizing this and like organizing me and getting me together. This is really awesome. Thank you for letting me participate. What I will do now is I'm just gonna like quickly share my screen. I do have some slides for you. And so let's go ahead and hide this. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just share just a little bit of preliminary research from my current book project, which examines how eugenicists in the early 20th century defined Blackness as a heritable sign of unfitness through their studies of mulattoes and other mixed race people with white and Black ancestry. Before I go any further, I should just give the audience a little bit of a warning. I do use the term mulatto, racial hybrid, miscegenation, octoroon, quadroon, etc. And I only use those terms just to stay in keeping with the historical context. My use of these terms is in no way an endorsement. So what I want to do essentially with this new project is to kind of fill a gap here in how we think about studies of racial fitness and eugenics, and particularly train our attention to the experiences of people with African ancestry. And what I found is that there is some residue of slavery that is present in how eugenicists study mixed race people, particularly people with Black and white ancestry. What I found is that while there are many books on the early 20th century eugenics movement, there are few that examine explicitly how eugenicists isolated and identified people with Black ancestry as inherently unfit. And I think this lack of engagement with the eugenic era constructions of mixed race people's bodies may stem from how historians have traditionally viewed eugenics, namely as simply this misguided pseudoscience that gave rise to forced sterilizations, Nazism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, ableism, etc. Now, all of these above aspects about eugenics are naturally true, but I think that we could take an even broader view of eugenics in both its meaning and its creation. So we might consider how anxieties about racial purity and fitness as they related to non-white people actually had a very long and storied history before the 20th century, and even before Sir Francis Galton formally coined the term eugenics in 1883. Daniel Kevles, one of the leading authorities on eugenics, has pointed out how roughly 20 years before coining the term eugenics, Galton had already set about writing about ways to improve human stock. And I should say that Galton did not hesitate, for example, to use Black people as an example of a group of a race that was mentally inept. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this actually occurs, as I said, a little bit earlier than 1883 in his 1869 publication, Hereditary Genius. Galton starts to investigate so-called origins of natural ability. And it was actually in Hereditary Genius that Galton theorized that Negro intelligence was on average 2 grades below that of the English, and it was not a sign of, quote, good stock, end quote. This assessment also reveals where Galton drew his information. He writes, quote, the number among the Negroes of those whom we shall call half-witted men is very large. Every book alluding to Negro servants in America is full of instances, end quote. So for Galton, the ineptitude of Black people was sort of this foregone conclusion. He kind of relies on data taken from the United States, from the Americas, and he's clearly talking about race as something that is biological. So what I want to do with this paper is to broaden this view about eugenics, broaden sort of what we mean when we talk about eugenics, thinking about broadly about racial fitness or unfitness, but also to think about what inspired eugenicists who chose to study race crossing and study people with African ancestry. So I want to draw attention to how many of these assumptions and expectations about mixed race people's bodies that eugenicists adopted in the early 20th century actually had their genesis in the era of slavery. So to put this rather bluntly, eugenicists essentially reframed 18th and 19th century ideas that had circulated about mixed race people with Black ancestry, and they simply dressed it up in eugenic rhetoric. They used precision measurements of vitality, skin color, hair texture, and intelligence to come to these conclusions about these groups of people being unfit. And what I will actually hopefully show today is that much of this information that eugenicists in the early 20th century are sort of disseminating really just comes from what I would say is the poison well of knowledge about Black and mixed race people that had already been in circulation in the Americas. And you know, it comes as no surprise that there is like no shortage of material that shows us white commentators, physicians, and scientists who, one, are assuming race as a biological feature and a way to sort of understand inherent fitness. So I have found a few scholars who are doing work on highlighting what I would say is maybe this kind of proto-eugenic preoccupation with the vitality and fitness of Black people and mixed race people's bodies. So I'm referencing specifically work by historians Paul Lowry and Leslie Schwalm, who have shown associations between Blackness and unfitness that emerged in vocabularies of science found in Civil War era army studies of white, Black, and mixed race troops. So you'll see here, this is just an image. The United States Sanitary Commission had sort of this anthropometric investigation of troops, Black, white, and mixed race. And sort of this is data that's compiled by Benjamin Gould, who was later known as like this astronomer, but he did actually work in an actuarial capacity for the Union. And his conclusions were simply that Black men lacked vitality, mulatto men also lacked vitality. And this is again coming out of the Civil War. So the hope here is, of course, broadening the historiography, transforming how we see eugenics as the study of fitness, and making sure we understand the influence of slavery era ideas on the eugenic gaze. Now, in this talk today, I will lay out how the mulatto became a socially and biologically constructed problem, as well as a proxy for discussing the inferiority of Black people. And this is very clear if we look at the writings of the Harvard-trained biologist, Charles B. Davenport, who was at one time America's leading eugenicist in the early 20th century. Davenport is known for conducting two studies on race crossing between Blacks and whites, the first in 1913 and the second in 1929. Davenport's studies were partially motivated by an unfounded fear of growing miscegenation, for he actually assumed that there was like a marked increase in the number of mulattoes in the United States. In trying to investigate like sort of where this motivation and where this fear comes from, digging into the census records, we actually find that it may look like there were more people classified as mulattoes, but this is due to a classification issue. In the 1870 census, mulatto could include people that were quadroons and octoroons, and any person that had a perceptible trace of African blood. And in the 1890 census, mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon were distinct categories. A mulatto was anyone with 3/8 to 5/8 Black blood, a quadroon had 1/4 Black blood, and an octoroon had 1/8 or any trace of Black blood. I should add here that it is extremely unclear how any census taker was supposed to know this from visual inspection. But these terms only appeared in 1890. By the 1910 census, which is what I suspect Davenport is looking at, the term mulatto was used to subsume everything. So instead of there being these distinctive categories, it just says mulatto now. So I'm wondering if this is why Davenport is sort of claiming that there is this sudden upswing in the early 20th century. I would also say that Davenport may be a bit of an outlier in some respects, because he tended to look for disharmony in Black and white racial crosses. He does not see evidence of hybrid vigor when he thinks about sort of so-called brown populations. This is quite distinct because there are others who are interested in studying so-called racial hybrids, and they may make a claim for hybrid vigor. They may say that there's actually a benefit. Davenport is not doing this, as far as I can tell from his papers. What Davenport sees is an inheritance of unfavorable traits from Black parents. And here I'm kind of toying with this notion of inheritance, because I can think about the inheriting of Black traits as a sense of inheriting the historical residue of Blackness as a status that could mark someone as a descendant of slaves. But I'm also thinking about inheritance quite literally as sort of the handing down of a physical feature of Blackness, and that we know that by this point in time, certain traits, Blackness in particular, had been seen as this peculiar medical biological thing, right? It had been fully reified at this time. So what I'm going to do now is really just focus on how medical knowledge about Blackness and a priori ideas about mixed race people's bodies that flourished during the era of slavery actually informed the research conducted by someone like Charles Davenport. In doing so, I'm actually kind of thinking of the ways in which that eugenicists are actually joining an already ongoing effort to bring stability to the concept of race, that by advancing this notion of a universal Black inferiority, while cautioning against race crossing. And what I see here is that Davenport is taking the time to engage in myths that circulated like sort of, centuries before, testing out their veracity, actually trying to say, okay, is this true about mixed race people? Is it not true? I'm going to actually study this and prove it. Now, I want to be clear that him, doing this, in some cases, he debunks some myths. It is not out of a humanitarian effort to rehabilitate the so-called racial hybrid. Actually, what I find is that he's simply replacing one set of negative viewpoints or modifying them with like a new set that he believes is founded upon objective data collection and precision measurement. So I'm just going to say a little bit about some of the myths in the slavery era that I think pop up in what Davenport researches. So for example, there is this idea that mixed race people were inherently weak. Now, I want to be clear, I know there's going to be variation if we look throughout the Americas, that, in some cultures, some of ex-slave colonies, you might see a completely different view. So for example, there are these competing views. If we look to Jamaica in the 19th century, historian Gad Hoyman has noted that whites in Jamaica seem to have regarded mixed race people with superstition and contempt. There is in fact evidence that the governor of Manchester in Jamaica actually doubted the ability of mixed race people to serve, to go on service, like military service overseas in Africa, for he described them as being too timid and weak. Other scholars have actually noted something quite different. So if we look at 18th century Saint-Domingue, historian William Max Nelson, for example, has highlighted an arresting proposition for the manufacture of human beings as sort of creating a force of mixed race men, mulatto men, to defend the island against foreign invaders and inside threats. This would be slave rebellions. And of course, we know that there was already a sort of men of color police force on the island. But the idea here is to say, well, these mixed race men have utility and that their bodies were not viewed as inherently unfit. So all of that to say that there is obviously variability. I will say that throughout the Americas, the mixed race offspring that resulted from interracial unions were subject to just a variety of claims, including ones that highlighted their supposed physiological limitations. If we go to mainland North America and southern United States, we find pro-slavery physicians willing to make all sorts of claims about mixed race people's bodies. So we can think, for example, of A.P. Merrill, a physician and editor of the Memphis Medical Recorder, who loudly complained in 1851 that the mulatto was, quote, less curable than white persons on account of his greater feebleness of constitution, end quote. If we again go back to Jamaica in 1834, we see the British Gothic novelist and owner of several Jamaican plantations, Matthew Lewis, casually complaining that mulattoes were, quote, almost universally weak and effeminate persons, end quote. And as I mentioned before in the slide with the US Sanitary Commission report, Benjamin A. Gould remarked in 1869 on the, quote, well-known phenomena of mixed race men having inferior vitality, end quote. And so we could think, for example, of what that means in terms of inferior vitality. I know that Lundy Braun has done great work on the study of the spirometer, which assesses lung capacity, and she certainly references some of Gould's, like those primary sources in her own work on the spirometer. So for Davenport, he's well aware of this. He's aware of this idea of the inherent weakness of mulattoes. He's also aware of the myth that mulattoes do not reproduce, that they are somehow infertile. And he actually digs into the origins of this myth. So I'll just sort of give you the quick rundown here. he talks about this mythology that mulatto people cannot reproduce together. And a lot of these ideas come from, they're clearly exaggerated and politically motivated, but we can look at figures from the era of slavery like the Anglo-Jamaican planter, Edward Long, and Josiah Nott, a Southern pro-slavery physician. So for example, in 1774, Long wrote that it was extraordinary that two mulattoes should be unable to continue their species, the women either proving barren or their offspring, if they have any, not attaining maturity. The subject deserves further and attentive inquiry. So that's in 1774. Josiah Nott basically took up that challenge. And in 1843, he wrote the article, The Mulatto, a Hybrid, Probable Extermination of the Two Races if Whites and Blacks are allowed to intermarry. Obviously, again, politically motivated, but we should note that Nott mentioned Edward Long by name as being a high authority on mulatto people, right? And he basically says that they do not produce so many children together. He suggests, and this is not, suggests that mulattoes have shorter lifespans than either whites or blacks, and the women are plagued by a physiological delicacy and an inability to conceive children, end quote. So they're obviously writing from very specific viewpoints as white men living in slave societies where interracial sex is an open secret. It is happening. And this is sort of, for me, I think, a way of expressing an anxiety and a failure to control that. What's interesting is that Davenport actually takes this up, right? And says, you know, okay, is this true? Where does this come from? And what's interesting is that Davenport basically points out Long and Nott in his 1913 study on the heredity of skin color in Negro white crosses. And he basically says that he observed that there was, quote, no support in our data for the notion of a lack of fecundity of Negro white crosses, nor of their deficient viability, end quote. And when he introduces this to say, okay, there is an ancient tradition that mulattoes are unprolific, the people who he credits this with are Long and Nott. Now, I should say that while he's saying, okay, it's not true that they cannot reproduce, that doesn't mean that he's going on a sort of rehabilitation of the mixed race person, because in an undated lecture, he talks about what features or traits the mulatto has. So he says, quote, the Negro has many advantages in physical quality over the white. He's much less apt to suffer defects of the spine, goiter, obesity, deaf mutism, deafness. The mulattoes show much of the excellent physical qualities of the Negro, end quote. However, he also notes that mulattoes showed a higher or extraordinarily high rate of tuberculosis, and the venereal disease rate is several times higher among the whites. He also notes in his 1929 race crossing study, quote, no evidence of hybrid vigor in the Browns, end quote. So this is to my point of he is not seeing this as any kind of biological advantage. But this just sort of gives you an idea of what I mean when I say in Davenport's notes, he is literally kind of trying to parse what traits are good and bad about mixed race people. And clearly he's informed by previous ideas about Black people's bodies and mixed race people's bodies. So I want to just say a little bit now about sort of physical features. So Edward Long, again, because of course, commented in his History of Jamaica, again, written in the 18th century, about the hair of mulatto people. He wrote, quote, they seem to partake more of the white than the black. Their hair has a natural curl. In some, it resembles the Negro fleece, but in general, it is of tolerable length, end quote. Now, you might think this might be a trivial objectifying sort of commentary, but in reality, Davenport actually bothered to diligently study the texture of mixed race hair. In fact, in his family pedigree analyses in his 1913 study, he noted the color, length, texture of mixed race hair, and the Eugenics Record Office, which Davenport founded in 1910, housed data collected from families, some of which actually included human hair samples. Pictured here, you will find a dossier from the McDonough family. This is a mixed race family from Jamaica, where apparently their hair samples ended up at the ERO. This is labeled Negro White Cross, and there are samples from the mother, father, 2 daughters, and 2 other family members. I still do not know under what circumstances the McDonough family felt that they should send their hair samples to the United States. Again, this is a family that lived in the parish of St. Anne in Jamaica. Somehow this wound up in the eugenics record office. Now, the point here, though, is that Davenport is interested in studying the texture of hair, the curl of hair, all of these things. And what's interesting here is that he sort of sees this notion of Black skin and hair color or hair texture not necessarily being related. So he says that there are cases of people who have light skin with kinky hair, people with dark skin with straight or wavy hair. But he does believe in this idea of just sort of kinky Negro wool. He uses this term quite frequently. And this is, again, language that we can think back to the era of slavery and descriptions of Black people's bodies. So I just want to move on now just to the study of mulatto intelligence. And this is really where Davenport deviates quite a bit from others interested in race crossing and intelligence. This would be sociologists, eugenicists, and anthropologists. There was a mythology very prevalent in the antebellum era that mixed race people, mulattoes, were sort of in between Blacks and whites with respect to intelligence, that the mulatto was always viewed to be of superior intelligence to the Black person, slightly less than the white person. So for example, if we look at an 1852 publication from the Southern United States, the writer notes, quote, "It appears at all events certain that the mixed race exhibits powers more susceptible to cultivation than the pure African. Every day's observation shows that the mulatto is endowed with mental gifts superior to his Black brother." So this is this idea of the mulatto being more intelligent. Now, this is not just a view confined to the American South. We can look to the Caribbean, and we see historians noting that plantation and estate managers often entrusted enslaved mulattoes with positions that required skill and intelligence, end quote. Davenport is just not on board with any of this. He was actually completely unconvinced that mixed race people had an edge. He swiftly took aim at the notion, the mythology of mulatto intelligence in the 1929 race crossing in Jamaica. And he basically writes, quote, "Whites scored higher than the Blacks, while the Browns secured an intermediate score. But a study of the distribution showed in many cases that about 5% of the Browns received lower scores than any of the Blacks or whites. The result is not due merely to the chance inclusion among the Browns of some individuals of unusually low intelligence. Rather, among the various Browns are some individuals who find themselves quite unable to make even a beginning on certain mental tests. There are fewer full-blooded Blacks who show such complete incapacity. It's reasonable to ascribe this idiosyncrasy of the Browns to their hybrid nature," end quote. So Davenport actually uses Knox Moron tests and Army Alpha tests. And in this way, I see him trying to use sort of precision data to say all of these myths that you have about mulattoes being somehow superior intelligence are completely wrong. I used objective tests and I've proved this to be not the case. So just to conclude, it's sort of clear that the constellations of ideas about what constituted, Blackness as a part of one's race and constitution and something that could be passed down clearly was alive and well during the era of slavery. And these ideas obviously showed remarkable endurance, and in some cases they evolved, but they were actually, I would argue, essential to the eugenic logic that emerges around race crossing. So at the same time, I think we can consider this culture, this approach of identifying and classifying groups of people and comparing them to each other for the purposes of understanding strength, weakness, contributions to civilization is clearly something that shapes eugenics, but it also is present in the era of slavery. And I would actually argue that slavery in some respects was clearly premised on a notion of the inherent soundness and fitness for Black people's bodies to labor. Once slavery ends, those assumptions change to a fear of dependency, in some cases a thought of extinction, if you're Frederick Hoffman. And so what happens then is sort of a shift in the ways that Blackness is being viewed as this inherited trait. What I see then for eugenicists and mixed race people is this idea that some races were just inherently fit, and that's sort of due to the Black traits in this case. So what I would say is that eugenics is invested in making legible the strengths and weaknesses of different types of people via their inherited traits. And one of the lasting consequences of slavery then was the rendering of Blackness as a legible physiological and phenotypic trait. And Davenport and others of his ilk seized upon this logic. His race-crossing studies shared with slavery-era discourse a desire to pathologize Black people's bodies by harping on their imagined peculiarities. his pathologization of the mulatto body should perhaps strike us as a predictable corollary. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. I could probably say too much, but it is frankly stunning how much Davenport was in conversation with mid-19th century racial scientists. So it's my pleasure, though, to introduce our next panelist, and that is Delphine Peretti-Cortis, who works on the construction of racial and sexual stereotypes on Black bodies within medical literature from the 19th century to the mid-20th century. She is the author of a chapter on French doctors and the sex of Black people in the edited volume, Sexualities, Identities, and Colonized Bodies, which came out in 2019. Her book, entitled Black Bodies and White Doctors, The Making of a Racial Prejudice, was published by La Découverte Editions in May 2021. And I will say, as an American audience member, we want an English translation if there are any editors in the crowd. It would be really great. Delphine's work is very exciting. She teaches contemporary history at the University of Marseille, and she is a member of the Telem Laboratory. She is currently studying concepts of virility and the consequences of racial and sexual stereotypes in colonial practices. She wrote a chapter in a collective book on this subject, which also came out this year, and the book is entitled Healthy and Masculinity in Colonial Context, A Virilization of African Men. Today, Delphine is going to be speaking with us about her paper and her book titled, at least the main central title, Black Bodies and White Doctors, Examining Racial Prejudice in the 19th and 20th centuries in the French colonial empire. So thank you so much for joining us, Delphine, and I'm going to give over the floor to you.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here to present my research. My subject here is the stigmatization of Black African sexuality in French medical literature, a threat to white settlers. From the beginning of the 19th century, the supposedly uncontrolled sexuality of Africans was considered dangerous and corruptive for explorers and white settlers. As from the second half of the 19th century, interracial relationships also caused concern for doctors, owing to the risk they posed in weakening the colonial system and blurring the boundaries between the settlers and those they colonized. Doctors in metropolitan France and colonial doctors were deeply interested in African sexuality, as it was considered a testimony to the social, sexual, and moral chaos that prevailed in African society. Colonization was thus presented as the means of taming and civilizing in African behavior and sexuality. Moreover, talking about the other's sexuality in terms of deviancy and excess permitted one to talk about one's own society in terms of defining the norms of a moral, moderate, and reproductive sexuality. My presentation is only a little part of thematic studies in my book, but it's an important part because the question of sexuality was very central and important in the French medical discourse about African people during 19th century and beginning of 20th century. Many arguments and recommendations were made about a sexuality that was supposedly specific to Africa, a sexuality shaped by race, climate, and culture, which threatened the white settlers in the colonies. Medical and anthropological work on human races, medical dictionaries, hygiene guides, and reports of colonial doctors have been analyzed for this study. They reveal scientific and colonial representation of African sexuality in the 19th century. The first part of this communication shows how a structural opposition between an African sexuality perceived as excessive and immoral, and then European sexuality viewed as civilized and controlled was constructed. In the second part, it raises the issue of interracial sexual relations between white and Black people and the denunciation of those relationship in the medical literature of the time. In the first part, an excessive and immoral sexuality in Africa. In my work, I show that during the colonial period, two diametrically opposed representations of sexuality were present in medical literature. The prudish, modest, moral, procreative, and moderate sexuality of civilized people living in temperate countries stood in opposition to a free, liberated, immoral sexuality given over to the pleasures and satisfaction of the primary instinct in the primitive inhabitants of warm countries. In his books Race humaine et leur part dans la civilisation, published in 1860, Dr. Adolphe Clavel stated that, I quote, "The love of the Negro is a passion that wants to be assuaged at whatever cost and does not shrink from violence. It seems to come from the heart and amass in the overdeveloped sexual organs. The sheer proportion of the sexual organs is in fact one of the characteristics of the Ethiopian race. Doctors in the first half of the century viewed the wantonness or hypersexuality of Black men and women as being a result of their sexual and cerebral anatomy, which was hypersexuality was one of the most common prejudices toward Africans in the 19th century in the medical literature. According to a powerful stereotype of the time, the supposed oversized genitalia of Black men and women were closely correlated with the practices of intense sexuality, the supposed hypertrophy of African sexual organs, and their supposed intense sexual activity were also believed to result from innate or racial factors linked to a particular anatomical composition of the brain. Indeed, according to several 19th century doctors and anthropologists, such as Broca, areas in the brain that were devoted to passion, the emotion, and primary instinct were overdeveloped in Black people. Unlike white people, the size of those cerebral zones for reflection and reason were overvalued. Thus, Africans' intellectual weakness went hand in hand with their hypersexuality. As seen is this quote published in the Gazette Médicale de Paris in 1841. This is why, with the Negroes' intellectual organs being less developed, their genitalia acquires greater preponderance and extension. Moreover, these scientific theories were disseminated to the general public through encyclopedias and dictionaries until the last third of the 19th century. What follows was written in the article Femmes, Women, in Pierre Laroux's Grand Dictionnaire universel du 19e siècle in 1872. Women, like men of the Negro race, are much more lascivious than white women. Nature seems to have granted to the physical function of this race what it has refused to the intellectual functions. End of quote. This sentence, taken from a scientific work written in 1815 by the pharmacist and naturalist Julien Joseph Viré in Dictionnaire des sciences médicales. On the other hand, white sexual temperance was seen by the doctors as being the result of greater intellectual development. Thus, faced with this type of representation, models of sexual conduct started appearing in medical dictionaries from the end of the 18th century. Whereas self-control and the practice of reproductive sexuality characterized civilized European inhabitants, the African model, one considered to comprise intemperate, inconsistent, and unproductive people, acted as a deterrent. Even South racial influence was blamed for the uncontrollable sexual behavior of Africans, even becoming seen as a fundamental factor in the first half of the 19th century. The environment was still considered responsible for the burning passion of Black men and women. In 1798, Dr. Marker said that in a very hot climate, love is for both sexes, a blind and impetuous desire, a bodily function, an appetite, a cry from nature, whereas in temperate countries, it's a passion that is still based on morals, that is calculated, that is analyzed, and that is often the project of education. In these discourses, moderation and self-control seems only to be embodied by those from temperate countries, while Africans symbolized excess, deregulation, and chaos in climatic, physical, moral, and sexual terms. Subsequently, it was moral excess and sexual overindulgence that colonization, supported by the colonists, proposed to control. It was essential that Black Africans' primary instincts, their way of life and behavior, were controlled by the settlers. Nevertheless, there were dissent, with some denouncing colonial civilization as a carrier of sexual vices for the indigenous people. At the same time, despite the idea of African sexuality that was natural, animal, and instinctive. René Trotman, a colonial doctor in the Congo, in the book published in 1922, evoked the natural simplicity of the sexual act among Black people. Like various people before him, Armand Corr, Léon Toxier, or Denis Pierre de Prétrals. Trotman asserted that vices against nature were produced by civilized populations. Consequently, it thought that Africans should be commended for their good sexuality, even though its intensity should be controlled. Subsequently, Although criticism of civilization, its culture, and its influence on the development of sexual perversion and vices emerged in the 20th century, they are nevertheless used to prove the Africans' simple lifestyle, which was seen as primitive and even animalistic by nature. In the second part, the title is Interracial Sexual Relationship, a Corrupting or Beneficial Sexuality. While doctors carried out numerous studies on African sexuality during the 19th century, their interest was also drawn to the long-term settlement of white men in the colonies. It was therefore necessary for scientists to consider interracial relationship and in particular to try and understand and explain the reason of their existence. In the absence of European women, the stability necessary for white men to settle in the colonized lands in the 19th century had indeed been contemplated through an ongoing relationship with a Black woman. This generated as much debate about their questionable and degrading status as it did about their beneficial and practical nature. In his guide for the military, civil servants, traders, settlers, and tourists in West Africa, Dr. Barrow, a doctor with the colonial troops, pleaded for what he called the necessary evil. How should Europeans conduct themselves in West Africa for those who do not have the strength to endure 2 years of absolute abstinence? There is only one possible course of action: a temporary union with a well-chosen, healthy, indigenous woman. Occasionally, these mixed relationships were even encouraged so as to benefit the colonial enterprise. Marriage between the colonists and an indigenous woman was in particular perceived by some as a way of strengthening the bonds of affinity that bound Blacks to the Europeans, thus facilitating the country's administrative tasks. of quickly learning the indigenous language, in a word, a key to understanding the Black soul. Thus, once again, the climate was preferred as another essential factor in explaining white men's sexual excesses, along with isolation in the colonies, celibacy, and boredom. The last external factor responsible for the fall of white men was the Black woman herself. Her naked body, lascivious behavior, and liberated morals were paramount in inciting European settlers to licentious conduct. These explanatory factors became commonplace in racial science and general literature. In Borid, Saint-Vincent, De Sales, Larousse, de Rochebrune, Hartmann, Gourdeau, Berthelot, or Murat. Thus absolving the colonists of their desires and the carnal relationship they had with African women. According to the colonial physician Nicolas Lacaze and Signol in 1885, I quote, "Whether or not it is the cause, Africa in particular seems to us to be one of the lands on the globe where the reproductive instinct is the most intense. The contrary would be quite surprising. In Europeans, the sexual function is incessantly solicited through natural excitement." I quote, "The woman naked, sensual, provocative, and relatively desirable," end of the quote. A woman like a metonymy of the African land appeared seemingly submissive and open to the colonist's desire. She embodied the relationship that united the colonies to the colonized territory. Upon their return from the colonies, many of those who had relationship with African women justified their own behavior in an indirect way by warning future settlers of the temptations that were present in their environments. I don't read this quote, but you can read this quote. Subsequently, colonial daughters, as well as travelers and racial theorists in metropolitan France, sought to warn men of the physical and moral dangers of reproductive excesses. The risk portrayed was that intense sexual activity with indigenous people would particularly weaken the white man to the point of resembling a primitive. Moreover, a range of diseases awaited him, in addition to possible syphilitic contamination. The young colonist could develop anemia, muscle tremors, hysteria, neurasthenia, and even general paralysis. The photography in the several books, the photography of naked woman illustrated their arguments. The photography had the aim to prove their ideas that woman in Africa is liberated, is naked, well naked. And in the colonial exposition and human exhibition, African women are sometimes exposed naked. The physical and moral dangers of reproductive excesses were evoked in the books. More importantly, these ideas were adapted so as to conform to the political and ideological requirements of the time and the need for moral standards for those men who had been dispatched to the colonies. Health and medical recommendations were tied up with political and social interests. Some theorists denounced the white man who gave into his impulses and thus bore the responsibility for the moral decadence and degeneration to the European race. Barth, Richer, Martial. Another concern was to preserve male resources and prevent him from becoming exhausting during sexual intercourse. Michel Foucault evoked the idea that the bourgeoisie transferred its values of moderation and sobriety to sexuality, while Alain Corbin, French historian, spoke of spare management. Although sexual activity between Black and whites was tolerated during the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, doctors often tried to demonstrate that it was immoral or even dangerous. Relationships between Black men and white women were explored, but always rejected. Some even expressed the impossibility of an union between a Black man and a white woman due to a physical mismatch between the sexes. Relationships between white men and Black women were permitted, but only to the extent that they remained temporary and did not result in a birth. Interracial relationship introduced an image of a multicultural and mixed race natural that was full of meaning and consequence. While some doctors, such as Dr. Barrow or Dr. Orgeas, stressed the effect of interbreeding, for example, miscegenation is viewed as sometimes a good and benefit for the colonization because addition of Black blood in the body of Métis could permit immunity against yellow fever. This immunity is another strong stereotype about Black people, but it remained in the background of scientific thoughts at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. The more common anti-miscegenation theories, such as those Brock, Martial, Broca, Béranger-Ferrot, Knott or Glidden in the United States, America, they highlighted the perceived risk associated with interbreeding, and in particular, the degeneration or even extinction of races. Polygenists like Knott and Glidden, like Broca, like Béranger-Ferrot in France, who believe in the existence of several human species, believe in the infertility of interracial relation from the fourth generation, and they believe that Métis have the vices and faults of both parents. In conclusion, conclusion and quickly conclusion, sexuality was used as a racial marker in order to dissociate civilized people of reason and culture from uncivilized people who were driven by emotion, nature, and sexuality. Sexuality seems to have set the bar when it came to assessing the stage of race had reached in terms of human development. Beliefs and knowledge revolving around sexuality contributed to defining the roles attributed to each race during the colonial era. Mastering sexuality seems to confer supremacy, and according to scientists of the period, justified the superiority of the colonists over African people. Thank you, and excuse me for my bad English.
No excuse needed. And thank you for that, Delphine. That really, I think this panel shows us why it's so central to have international conversations about race, because race was a global system being implemented in so many different spaces. And I want to take this now to introduce our commentator today for this second panel. Jim Downs is the Gilder Lehrman National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Civil War Era Studies and History at Gettysburg College. He is the author of Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, which came out this year with Harvard University Press. And I will say I started reading it this week and already stunned by both Jim's command of style to make us really think intimately about the people studied, but also the way I think his book is going to reframe knowledge production in colonial spaces. So also he's the author of a book that's already transformed the historiography, Six from Freedom, African-American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation, which came out in 2016 with Basic Books. He has edited 6 anthologies, including Beyond Freedom, Disrupting the History of Emancipation, which he co-edited with David Blight, and was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2017. He's published essays in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Vice, Slate, and among others. He is the editor of Civil War History and a partner at History Studio. He earned his BA from the University of Pennsylvania in English, his MA in American Studies from Columbia University, his MPhil and PhD in History from Columbia University. In 2015, he was awarded a multi-year Andrew Mellon New Directions Fellowship that enabled him to earn postgraduate training in medical anthropology at Harvard University. So with that, I'm going to give the floor over to our esteemed commentator for the next 10 or 15 minutes. I don't know. So look forward to it. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super psyched to be here, and I really enjoyed both papers. And I'm just going to begin with a sort of introductory remark about both papers, and then I'm going to give more individual comments and reactions. So the first thing is that it's really generative and wonderful to see this kind of work being done on race and empire and more broadly defined race and medicine. When I began my own dissertation research for my first book, Sick from Freedom, in the early 2000s, a large part of the historiographical conversation around race and medicine came out of South Asia, which was really wonderful. I mean, it was David Arnold's work, and there was other studies, and then some work later came out about the actual continent, about race and medicine on the continent in Africa. But really, with few exceptions, there was very little about slavery, and there was very little about race in general, about people of African descent. So to me, this is a much needed intervention. It's also quite an auspicious time to have this panel because it coincides with the much anticipated release of Chris Willoughby and Sean Maurice Smith's book, Medicine and Healing in the Age of Slavery, which, as Chris said, came out this past week. And that is, again, part of a larger group of emerging scholars. Ron is part of this as well, that are really trying to recenter the study of medicine away from simply Western biomedical frameworks, and to sort of think about the centrality of slavery and race as critical to that. So I offered that context as a way of saying that both of these papers advance our understanding of race and medicine and empire within this broader context, and are part of a larger, more robust emerging discussion within the field, all of which is exciting. Both papers are dealing with both the sort of historical, if prurient, fascination with Black bodies. And so there's always important work to be done in this area. It's important for us to interrogate these sources, but we also need to be careful about the ways in which we're representing these bodies, and to make sure that we don't fall into the same kind of discursive traps that led to the creation to begin with. And I think there are ways of doing that. I'm going to offer that in my comments. And the other piece of it is that so much of what both historians are writing about is deeply rich and deeply important. And I think that each of them could have taken one source from their paper and made it the entire paper. So for me in this way, I would have loved a complete deep dive by Rana simply into the notion of hair. I mean, that whole episode around hair. Now, of course, that plays into like replaying that sort of discourse about hair and essentializing Blackness and sort of all of these problems. But I think that one of the things I want to be able to see is less of a reporting of the source and more of an analysis of the source. And so by taking one source for each paper, what you'll be able to do is really drill down more deeply into why this matters. And I just picked, Delphine, for you. I mean, I thought the Paris Gazette source was fascinating because it was just one line about sexuality and race. And again, it just sort of struck me as like, why in 1841 is this particular document even emerging? And can we really drill down a little bit deeper on the source and why it matters and why it's circulating in Paris at this particular time? And I'll talk to you more about this when I get to your analysis, but it seems like you have all of these different sources from these different places in these different times, and you've sort of organized them together like a very good historian, but there was a way in which it was devoid of context, like why 1841, why 1798? In other words, to really think more historically about why these particular statements are emerging at this particular time. So on that note, I thought the same with Rana's. So on one level, this is I'm going to start with Rana. This is a really important, brilliant intervention within the history of medicine, within the history of science, within the history of social science, because we often think about the study of eugenics as an isolated topic that just seems to emerge out of nowhere. And of course, once Rana lays out that there's a mid-19th century term, which Chris already kind of talked about in his own sort of quick reaction to it, it makes sense that the link between the 1850s and the early part of the 20th century is there. And Chris's new work that studies the biography of doctors is actually offering an interesting new metric that could be really useful for Rana's work. And that is to say, when we look at the history of medicine and science along a particular broad time frame, we divide it into very specific periods. But when we think about how these doctors were trained, in other words, that these doctors are emerging in the early part of the 20th century. Who trained them? Generationally, we can, and this is again, and I know, I don't need to tell you because you were trained by John Warner, but I mean, I think that his work in this particular way of thinking about doctors training and the periods and places and how it's being trained and how they're being trained matter. So early 20th century doctors, of course, are coming to age by physicians, parents, doctors, other people who are coming out of the 19th century. So of course, the slavery issue is most apparent. I guess there are a couple of things, there are other things that you've done that I think are really important. I think if any of you have ever looked through medical records of the late 19th and early 20th century, the nomenclature around racial identity is absolutely confusing. Rana did an absolutely wonderful job of sort of saying that in the 19th century, by the end of the 1890 census, by the end of the 19th century, there is a rigid racial classification in the United States that actually undermines the current understanding of, Black is based on the one-drop rule. No, it's not in the 19th century. It's not just based on the one-drop rule. It's based on a very rigid system of classification that runs the gamut, as Ron has said, from the quadroon, octoroon, mulatto. And then all of a sudden, as Rana perfectly said, by 1910, all of those racial categories get subsumed under the mulatto. So there, as a historian, she's very smart in sort of distinguishing the difference between these two periods. The question for me is not the medical piece of this. It's not the science. It's like, why is there all of a sudden this intrigue with racial classification, and why does that matter? So in this particular case, I'm hoping that in the broader project, you step outside of the sources and you're saying, what's happening in 1910 where all of a sudden the mulatto matters? The mid-19th century classification obsession with the mid-19th century obsession with classification results from two main factors. One, it's around the pro-slavery debate, and two, it's about Northerners, as I sort of talk about in my own work, becoming sort of tricked by the idea that, well, there's a person who's passing. So what's happening in the early part of the 20th century that's causing people to think more rigorously about racial classification? And I can't help but think about the Great Migration and other social factors that are now placing, as emancipation did, white people in the face of Black people, and that there's this moment in order to justify Jim Crow segregation, that there's this dependence on science. And this is really interesting because science at this point begins to emerge as a kind of authoritative power. And so it's used obviously to buttress Jim Crow segregation, but it's also becomes like an organizing principle to sort of think about all of these broader changes that are happening. So there's something there. The piece on the hair, I think you could go and do a lot with this. One, I think in a throwaway comment, you mentioned, what is visual inspection? And I think that they thought, what is visual? Like they couldn't tell. I mean, I don't want to get like too personal, but like the difference with people's color, the gradations of their color, they can't tell, right? So what are they doing? They're groping for something that they can tell. And so in your particular paper, you're looking at hair. In Delphine's particular paper, she's looking at the sexual organ. So in some way, you can say that the notion of race begins to fall apart, so that they're sort of grasping for something empirical. They're grasping for some kind of analysis. And that's in many ways similar to Delphine's work on the sexual organs. They're searching for some kind of biological difference. But then again, Rana, and I know you know this history, biology, science are all coming in, and social science are all developing and all emerging as authoritative. And so now they want evidence. So hair becomes evidence. Hair sort of functions as a kind of like evidence within social science, where in the 1840s or 1850s, people could say these people are 2 scales down, 3 scales down from, you know, the Brits, but they didn't need evidence. Now, all of a sudden, it's the emergence of social science that's forcing them to actually get tangible evidence. So I think there's, again, pushing out on those sources and doing a little bit more. And again, it's just, again, why all of a sudden this fascination with classification. And so, look, this is the moment, I don't know why I thought about this just right now, but Ida B. Wells starts fighting lynching through social science research and starts thinking about statistical analysis. So in other words, when we're looking at this moment, we're seeing this as like, you know, this idea of how the social sciences are being marshaled in order to validate particular claims. I think you could step out on that a little bit more on that piece. And then, of course, your first book is in perfect dialogue with Khalil Muhammad's book on criminalizing Blackness. So it's like medicalizing Blackness, criminalizing Blackness, and his book does pick up on the whole idea of the uses of the social sciences. But there is this idea of, and even within epidemiological analysis, this is prior to the development of biostats, but they're still thinking about statistical analysis. So there's something there to sort of play with. Delphine, again, like Rana, I thought your paper was really great. I think that you're uncovering lots of important sources. I think that this is enormously helpful within the broader history of medicine and empire to uncover what's happening in French-speaking places within French archives. So I think all of that is wonderful. And so it needs to be a little bit more organized, because the way that it was presented was just, it seemed like you were sort of cherry picking. And I know that's not what happened. By the end of the paper, I understood it. By the end of the presentation, I understood it much better. But in the beginning of the paper, it seemed like you were just picking all of these different moments when people were talking about race in a dictionary here, or in a newspaper there, or over here in some correspondence. I get it. But I think what you need to do is flip the presentation. I think you need to start with the second half and say that there's this anxiety around intercourse between French men and African women. There's this concern about marriage between these two parties. And as a way for the French to reconcile these relationships that are developing, they're reaching for science and medicine and biological difference and a discourse on race as a way to kind of understand this development. Because in many respects, when you start the way that you're starting and you're like, well, there's larger sexual organs, and you're saying this is larger sexual organs in the 1840s, 1830s, when French people come to the continent, there's a larger history from Jennifer Morgan and others from the 16th century where people have already made that discussion. People have already made that observation. The Europeans, the French, the English, they've already commented on the genitalia being monstrous and being sort of, and that monstrous genitalia among women in particular, this is Jennifer Morgan's argument in Laboring Women, reifies racial ideology. So when you pick it out that way, you're then saying, why 1840 when people, scholars and other people have already done this in in the 16th century. So what you should start with is, I think, the end of the presentation, which is like, wait a minute, all of a sudden the French become really concerned about the relationships between these people. They're trying to understand them. And they go back to a definition that happened in 1798, or they go back to an 1841 Paris Gazette. So all of this medical stuff gets plucked out at certain moments in order to explain this larger phenomenon. I also think, the idea that sexuality supports colonization, the idea that their body is better, I think it's a good point. But I think it's something people have said already. I think that you're on stronger ground, you're doing more original work. When you're talking about, and I heard it as an implication, not as a fully formed statement, which is there's an anxiety about French people's sexuality that's getting framed as Black women's sexuality. So it's like, she's lascivious, she's causing all the actions, because that's the 19th century conceptualization. It's like, this is the reason why women were blamed for being raped. It's because you've done something, to cause a man to behave like this. This is the 19th century. So when they're reporting these Black women are lascivious, it's a way of shifting the blame away from the fact that the Frenchmen are lascivious, the Frenchmen are predatory, the Frenchmen want to have sex. And it's narrating it through the Black women's body. And so what I think is happening is, like, you can look at the source as a way of saying there's this whole world of sex that's happening, and they're trying to justify and narrate why the Frenchmen are doing it. And they're all of a sudden, by the 19th century, because of these larger conversations about sex and so forth, they're becoming increasingly concerned with miscegenation. So something, and this is where it has to be social, like during the period of the 16th or 17th century, maybe it wasn't that predominant, but you would have, French slavers having sex with women, and this is part of Jessica Johnson's work and so forth. But when you get to colonization, the scale and scope of sexual relations increases, and that then leads to the discourse about it. So I think that's how I think you can frame it. Anyway, I think it's really good. I think it's wonderful. Both of you have done really excellent work. I'm happy to invite more comments and questions and reactions during the Q&A.
Okay, so before I pass it on to our speakers to respond, I want to let my esteemed co-host do a little translating, beauty of a multilingual conference. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jim, for these great comments. So I'm just going to translate a little bit into French what Jim has said, so that Delphine has a better idea of maybe the questions that were asked to her. And then Delphine, you can answer, maybe you can try to answer in English if you feel like it, or you can answer in French, and I'll try to translate it back into English. Alors, du coup, je passe en français. Plusieurs choses en fait sur lesquelles Jim est revenu. La première, c'est qu'il voulait avoir davantage d'informations sur les sources différentes que tu as utilisées, puisque tu as à la fois parlé de sources qui datent par exemple des années 1840, qui sont des extraits de gazettes publiés à Paris, ou bien des rapports médicaux, des sources médicales, donc plein de types de sources différentes. Et en fait, il aurait aimé peut-être que tu reviennes un petit peu sur la cohésion générale de pourquoi tu as choisi ces différentes sources, et surtout le contexte qui est différent à chaque fois, parce que quand on parle de 1840, on se place à une époque différente. L'Empire français n'était pas ce qu'il était en 1860, en 1880, ainsi de suite. Donc si tu pouvais peut-être un petit peu plus entrer dans la nuance et expliquer en quoi l'évolution est différente entre ces différents contextes, plutôt que présenter tout, en fait, toutes ces sources différentes qui émanent de différentes dates comme un tout qui a une cohésion d'ensemble. Et le deuxième grand commentaire que j'ai que j'ai entendu là, c'était vraiment sur le thème que tu avais sur les questions en fait de comment la sexualité en vient, en fait les théories sur la sexualité en viennent à soutenir l'effort de colonisation dans l'Empire français. Et en fait, Jim te proposait plutôt de partir de l'autre bout, qui était de montrer en quoi en fait, toutes ces théories médicales qui sont développées au XIXe siècle par les médecins français permettent pour eux en fait de se dédouaner des perversions sexuelles, puisque là on parle par exemple de fantasmes, on parle de violence en fait d'hommes blancs français sur des femmes noires, et donc plutôt de partir de ça pour parler de ces questions de sexualité plutôt que de partir partir de l'autre bout. Et donc, il se pose la question, par exemple, de si tu vois que la colonisation finalement induit davantage de sexual intercourse, donc de rapports sexuels entre hommes blancs et femmes noires, et si ça ne serait pas justement ça qui entraînerait ensuite des justifications scientifique, médical, pour expliquer que c'est le corps de la femme noire qui provoque les hommes blancs. Voilà. Donc, si tu peux peut-être un peu revenir sur ça.
I am sorry, but if it's possible, I prefer to formulate my answer in French to keep the nuance important in this type of this today. I'm afraid of not being able to be nuanced and clear if I speak in English, of not being able to correctly formulate my ideas. So if it's possible, Elodie, to translate my...
Yes, of course. I'll do that. Just try to speak slowly, and I'll like to stop like every 3 or 4 sentences so that I can try to translate it back.
Oui, je vais essayer d'être bref pour que ce soit pas trop difficile pour toi. Alors, le but a été d'étudier dans tous ces différents documents des écrits médicaux. Je vais peut-être essayer quand même en anglais. The goal was to study medical discourses in several sources, sources more important, like Broca, like
right. Yeah.
popular anthropologist, famous anthropologist, and in the sources of doctors who are less famous. The goal was to study the medical thought in the most famous study and the writing less. Je pense, Elodie, que je vais peut-être te demander de l'aide. Le but, voilà, a été d'étudier la pensée médicale dans les écrits les plus célèbres, mais également dans des écrits beaucoup moins connus, pour voir quelles étaient les convergences entre ces écrits, entre ces médecins. Et le but a été d'étudier à la fois des dictionnaires médicaux, des ouvrages sur les races humaines, mais aussi des journaux, des gazettes médicales, des rapports de médecins, pour voir là aussi les convergences entre des écrits qui étaient diffusés face à la communauté médicale, ou encore des écrits qui étaient diffusés face au grand public ensuite, dans des journaux bien plus diffusés, comme la Revue des Deux Mondes, ou encore dans des encyclopédies généralistes. My first answer.
Okay, so Delphine is saying that her goal was to use documents that were from various sources, as she mentioned before, so famous physicians and less famous physicians, so maybe works that have not been studied in the historiography, but also she was interested in looking at the way medical reports and medical findings that were published in medical reports were then republished in more general mainstream newspapers, such as the Revue des Deux Mondes in France. And so this step of translation from the medical field to the more mainstream audience interested there.
To understand the diffusion of the South, the medical South, diffusion to the society. For the period, the large period, 18th century up to 20th century, pour les discours sur la sexualité, durant cette période, effectivement, il y a des va-et-vient, des retours entre la fin du 19e et les débuts du 18e siècle, parce qu'en fait, le climat explique au départ la sexualité. Ensuite, la race devient le facteur prédominant pour expliquer la sexualité, mais il y a encore au 19e siècle le facteur climatique qui est encore important pour expliquer la sexualité. Donc, il n'y a pas de… Justement, le but était de montrer les permanences dans ce discours des médecins français autour de la sexualité, et la grande différence est introduite par la période coloniale avec la peur des relations interraciales. Et effectivement, donc je n'introduis pas véritablement d'évolution spécifique autour de la sexualité entre le 18e et le milieu du 19e siècle, parce qu'il y a les mêmes peurs, les mêmes craintes, ou l'idée d'une hypersexualité. Et c'est surtout à partir de la période coloniale que le métissage, les questions sur le métissage se développent fortement. Et c'est pour cela que j'ai introduit une deuxième partie sur le métissage.
Okay, so I'm going to try to translate. So Delphine is saying that what interested her were the permanent topics that were raised by medical theorists and physicians throughout the 19th century. And what she found particularly interesting relating to the topic of sexuality was the fact that sometimes there were medical theories from the later period, the mid-19th century, quoting or referencing theories from the earlier period relating to the theories, for example, that the climate would have an impact on sexual behavior, or that race would have an impact on sexual behavior. And so she wanted really to show that there was a coherence, even though there are evolutions that she didn't detail here, between those topics.
And I tried to answer in English for the last question. According to Michel Foucault, the explosion of theories about sexuality during the 19th century, which aimed to control and confine the topic to the strict framework, in fact, led not only to prohibited practices, but also to the intensification of sexual desire in France. Freudian analysis, which inspired Franz Fanon and Edward Said in the reading of colonial sexuality, which was repressed in the West, was projected onto indigenous women. So the discourses, in fact, permit to the doctor, the physician, and the colonial administrator to accept this behavior. Je suis désolée, je n'arrive plus à le formuler clairement, mais bien sûr, c'est les contacts induits par la colonisation qui amplifient ces relations sexuelles et qui amplifient également la peur de ces relations sexuelles. Et effectivement, il y a la volonté pour ces médecins et ces colonisateurs aussi de se dédouaner de leur propre comportement et les fantasmes que l'on retrouve sur ces femmes qui sont présentées comme nues, comme libertines, sont en effet des fantasmes, les fantasmes de leur propre société projetés sur d'autres femmes, puisque la France au XIXe siècle, effectivement, tente d'enserrer la sexualité dans des cadres très fixes, très normés. Je suis désolée, Elodie.
So Delphine just said that, yes, she agrees with the idea that colonization increased probably the number of, contacts and promiscuity, relationships between men, white men and Black women. And so as a consequence of that, there were more and more anxieties, social anxieties regarding the topic of sexuality, of intermixing in French society, and that's why more and more medical doctors, physicians, medical theorists, anthropologists started to be more and more interested in developing theories pertaining to this political and broader social theme. That's
Thank you so
what
much.
I remember from what Delphine said. Sorry.
Thanks, Delphine. No, this is great. So Rana, I want to make sure you have some time, and we do have some questions in the Q&A and chat that hopefully we can get to. So Rana, if you have any responses you want to give.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll try and be brief. So one, this is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much, Jim. So a couple of things I should say. I cut a lot of. It's like I'm trying to cram the second book into like the 25 minutes, and that's probably not feasible. So it's true. I could have just sat with a particular source or object. So here's what I will do. First and foremost, in terms of, my discussion of the mulatto and that sort of like Davenport's, oh my gosh, there's more of them. I should also contextualize, you're absolutely right. The Great Migration is of great concern. But there's also something that I'm trying to iron out in my mind, and that is to say, in 1908, the Springfield race riot in Illinois transpires. Several Black men are lynched. It's your standard story of white women claiming they were assaulted by Black men. Is this true? No. To two people who were lynched was a Black man named William Donegan. He was lynched, he was in his 80s or something. He had been married to a white woman in this town for ages, nobody said boo. But suddenly, it became this whole issue. And the newspaper headline in the Atlanta Constitution was interracial marriage, a cause for great, like that was the thing that spurred the mob violence, not the fact that these white men came and sort of decided they were going to find somebody to lynch, but it was framed as, okay, this is the problem, right? So this is in 1908, that's in Springfield, Illinois. I think you're absolutely right in thinking about the Great Migration and the changing of the demographic landscape. And I think to myself, this family had lived in this town and nobody, he had lived for that long, married to a white woman, or at least cohabitating, and people knew it. But this was the time that they were going to attack him. So I wonder, and ostensibly kill him. What I think is going on, and I think you're completely right in mentioning how eugenics holds the promise of precision as a way to deal with the so-called problem of the color line and the so-called Negro problem, which that is how it is referred to. I especially like your point on social sciences, because like what will become the Social Science Research Council has a whole committee on the Negro problem, where you have the top names in biology showing up to contribute. So you have Davenport, like Boas, Arles Herdlicka, like all of these individuals who study race, like anthropologists, they're convening in the 1920s to say, okay, how do we tackle the problem of the so-called Negro? So I have those notes from the American Philosophical Society, has like the meeting minutes. Now, they don't get to do much with the committee. It ends up being disbanded, but the fact that they're sitting down and having this discussion on how to solve this as like a science, a problem that we can deal with if we just put our minds to it and use the tools at our disposal, is very much on point with what you mentioned, Jim. I would also say to the point, particularly of statistics and I.W. Wells, I should say that this desire of quantifying, right? So it's not that they're quantifying skin color, because they're using Milton Bradley color tops to percentagize the Black and white in skin. But there is also this sense with Galton and Carl Pearson, who I don't get into in this talk, where you're looking at statisticians, right? Mathematicians who are calculating, coming up with formulas, saying we're going to predict with clarity racial like hybridity. So it's almost as if to say, we want to compile data. We want to show this kind of mastery over nature, something that we see going on that is unstable, and we're going to kind of tame it in this way. And eugenics and biostatisticians try to do this. I also think of Frederick Hoffman. As we know, he kind of hides behind the cloak of statistical analyses and looking at sort of the supposed extinction of Black people. So something that I think about, as you mentioned, I.W. Wells, is to sort of pair together and marry together this different use of statistics. And we can think about, of course, there were a number of critiques of Hoffman's work by Black statisticians and mathematicians too, who said, we can use statistics too to prove you wrong. I would also say that I didn't have time to talk about Carolyn Bondé, who was an African-American anthropologist trained at Harvard under Ernest Houghton, who writes her own race crossing study, but has a completely different objective. And so what I see with this project is actually to say, one, the mixed race figure needs our attention as sort of a target of eugenicist, the eugenicist gaze. which it has not had. There is not a book that is on eugenics and the mixed race Black person or mixed race person with Black and white ancestry. And I focus on this group because I think you're right in looking generationally as where knowledge is produced, circulated, and sort of kept alive. It is through looking back at the 19th century. Who are the people they learned from? Who are they citing? Where did they get this from? And of course, this leads us to slavery, which is again part of this big intervention that I seek to make, which is to say, that's fine that everyone looks at Mendel, and that's fine that everyone says, oh, look, we have a new discovery in the sciences about how to categorize and calculate people. But I also want to say, yeah, we should also be looking at slavery, which also drives how you choose to apply that and how you choose to target and reduce down the bodies of specific people. Which brings me to your specific point about hair, which, oh my gosh, like part of me is like, could I just write a separate book on hair? Because hair in and of itself is such a culturally and socially, and I would say politically, touchy subject, particularly when we think about African-American women's hair and the policing of Black women's hair. What I wanted to say and what I wanted to sort of get at, which is something that I think Peggy Pascoe does an excellent job in her book on miscegenation, sort of to show examples of how hairdressers are called as expert witnesses in divorce cases to say, okay, this person misrepresented themselves as being white, but it turns out they're Black, and I'm going to ask the hairdresser to testify. For me, what I am seeing here is a kind of sense that we will fully objectify and reduce down to the body these features that are meant to be the giveaway. There's discussions of noses, like, oh, this person, if you squint carefully enough, you'll see that they actually have a Black nose. Or if you look carefully at their hair, that's going to be the giveaway for somebody who might dare to pass. What's interesting then for me is to see a way in which Davenport suggests that it takes a kind of skilled person to read a body. So you're reading and reducing down this body, and you're looking at these key features to sort of allow you to out that person. I didn't have time for it here, but there is a very interesting note in one of Carl Pearson's papers at UCL from someone who writes to him and says, hey, by the way, I've done all this information on race crossing for you. There is somebody right under your nose. He uses a term, right under your nose. You'll have to squint to see it, but he's completely trying to pass himself off as a white person, and I happen to know that he's not. And he gives him, he's like, you have to look at the nose. You have to look at how he regards himself. You will see that he's actually, quote, a Negro. And it is like, I mean, I almost fell out of my chair when I was at UCL when I read this, because this is like somebody telling this biostatistician, oh, let me just tell you, by the way, you've done these formulas. This is how you find them. So for me, there's also the letter of the woman in Michigan to Davenport that says, oh, let me tell you about this family, like writing to the ERO to try and out people who are passing. And it all boils down to them looking at the hair, the nose, the lips, all of these things. So it's almost like these terrifying citizen scientists trying to out people who might be passing or might have racial ancestry. So that's a component of the work as well. So I do really appreciate, what I have to do is like calm down with my sources because I love them and focus on one and do the deep dive to show why it matters. What does it mean to reduce down one's identity and collapse that into a feature that then gets sort of the sanctioning from scientists and biologists and zoologists and all of these people who are on board with it. So all of that to say, thank you for these comments, and this will help me as I try to fine tune and rein in this very unwieldy but extremely exciting situation I have going. So thank you.
Well, that's great. And sometime, Rana, we have to talk about hair. See each other all the time, but never talk. So I wanted to say thank you for the Q&A. It's robust. So I'm going to try and get to that and also echo Jason Glenn, who made a comment basically saying that these are fantastic papers, and he wished, just like myself, that Americans, including myself, were multilingual, but even having these conversations translated are so important, so fantastic, and make our profession better. So with those limitations in mind, I think it's still, I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to start off with two questions, one for each of you from Maxine Guten. The first is for Rana, and then second is for Delphine. So she says, and I'm looking weirdly into a screen to the side, but that's, I read them. So you mentioned examples of 18th century attempts at exploiting human perfectibility before the word eugenics was coined. What do you do of these earlier cases in the 18th century? And how do animal and vegetable breeding produce a knowledge link to eugenics. And then I'm going to read the question she has for Delphine, even though Rana will go to you first. And if Elodie, you need to help at all, that's fine too. So this is, you focused on the case of Black bodies and their associated hypersexuality. One can also think of Lord Kames, this is the 18th century British polygynist, statement about sexual frigidity of the American race, for instance. Thus, my questions are, have you found other examples of the types of sexualities associated to specific races? And what role sexuality played in relation to other determinant of races in the very classification of different races? So Rana and then Delphine, and Elodie, if you need to jump in.
Okay, so I'll be quite, I can actually do this briefly. So I'll answer the first part of the question. So I should say that Davenport was not above, in his lecture notes, talking about breeding of different kinds of hens and chickens, and then jumping right to people. Like, so saying that when he talks about disharmonious crosses, he very much used animal models, and in some senses he got dinged for this by others of his ilk, who would say, you're kind of being sloppy and just assuming that these traits are gonna, you're gonna have these animal traits that will show up in people. He focuses more on animals, and I should say that his assistant in writing Race Crossing in Jamaica, Morris Stigurda, was actually a PhD student in zoology. So just to give you a sense of the training of the individuals who participate in the race crossing studies are very much in tune with the idea of breeding and crossing in agriculture, animals and vegetables. So certainly for sure that's true. To the first question that you have raised about the 18th century and sort of this proto-eugenics kind of issue, here's what I will say. So the idea of fitness and unfitness is naturally a fluid and slippery context concept that is contingent on context, right? So if we think, for example, of the West Indies, and I will confine myself to the British West Indies because this is where I have most of my source base. The idea is that at some point, the mixed race person can be tolerated, right? So Edward Long, in his very, very long history of Jamaica, he will say that mulatto women are well-shaped and well-formed. He will have some positive traits about like their behaviors, that they could be good at certain professions like nursing people and caring for people. But then, of course, there's the problem that he can't escape from. The fact is that why are there so many mixed race people in Jamaica? The hint is there are not many white women in Jamaica, so we can see what is happening. So there's kind of like this sense of it's okay and acceptable under some circumstances. I would also add, in thinking about Brooke Newman's excellent work on sort of like whiteness and identity in Jamaica, there became a certain point in the 18th century where if you were mixed enough and removed enough from Blackness, we'll take you, is essentially kind of the attitude. So I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So the idea is that in some cases, the blending of whiteness, if you were specifically in an island that had a Black majority and you were kind of trying to sort of grapple with that, there are cases where the racial mixture is like, okay, this is fine, and these people seem to be well-formed enough. But I think the issue of like saying that they're, I don't think anybody's saying they're sought after, if you know what I mean. So nobody's saying, okay, in the 18th century, like we must strive to have more of these people. That reference I gave you to Saint-Sauvin was sort of already was in existence. There was already a mixed race police force of men who were meant to sort of stop slave rebellions. And that language that William Max Nelson notes about sort of breeding these men, it sort of comes from, I guess you could say it is never put into fruition, like it doesn't come to fruition as a national program of breeding mulatto men, but it's sort of like, to me, a commentary on controlling already an island that has slippages with racial intermixture. So I don't necessarily see it as like, the concept of perfectibility, but I guess you could say there are attempts to say these groups can be fit, these groups can serve a purpose, but I think it really depends on the context and who is saying it and when. So thank you for your question.
Delphine?
I try to speak English. I found other discourses about sexuality of other races, Asiatic people, named yellow race, that was guided for the doctors by money for prostitution, particularly for the women. But the doctor considered that Asiatic people, they don't interested by sexuality. And the sexuality had a place, an important place in the classification of races, because the supposed hypersexuality of Black people do them person who close to animals, and they belong to the first stage of humanity with this representation of their sexuality. So sexuality was as a real place in the classification of races, and this example is for Asiatic people, but other examples can be evoked for white people, because the climates in the 18th and 19th century were important to define the classification, to define the classification in France between inhabitants of south of France. Climate is very hot, and the sexuality was supposedly very more hot than Parisian and inhabitants of north of the France. So sexuality is very important to classificate races, but population in the same country by the climate particularly.
Thank you. So we have another question, and this one's from the chat, and it's from Joanna Seltzer. And she asks, my understanding is much of racial classification stems from the castas, first created in Spain in the late 1400s, which used mestizo and mulatto as mixed race categories. I guess her question is, where do, and she says, is that backed by historians here? But we could say, more broadly, where does that play into this kind of Spanish potential origin moment for mixed race identity play into your studies?
So yeah, so there's two things that I would say. So one, it is true that the English, so for example, Edward Long is so kind and puts a chart in the history of Jamaica where he says the Spanish use this, and he does actually explicitly say the Spanish are responsible for this kind of a classification system, where he lists, mulattoes and other things. Edward Long will also say in other cultures, they have another language for it. Davenport borrows this as well, but also sprinkles in some classifications from other parts of Latin America. So for example, the Mangro and Sambo, not the character Sambo, but Sambo is also a term used for mixed race people that come out of the Caribbean. But here's the thing, with respect to the castas, there is it's like more than just like 5 or 6. They're like these paintings, right? It's like 16 different versions. There's the torna atrás, like the turn around and come back. This is the reference to like the racial atavism, right? That you will have a throwback that will show up. So yes, it's true that does have origins in sort of Spanish New World, empire. And I think Rebecca Earle has like an excellent article on the casta paintings and sort of like identity. It's sort of a wonderful blend of sort of the visual culture, but also like these enduring categories that have a very specific function, right, for taxation purposes. And I think in that context, again, I always want to be careful of context, how the casta paintings are used and sort of what those identities mean, I think are going to change over time in the 18th century, and specifically thinking about Mexico and other parts of sort of Central America where these images and languages used is going to be quite different though, right, from once you get into Jamaica, right, even in the 18th century, and then certainly once you get into the 20th century, like some of the terms that Davenport uses when he studies race crossing in Jamaica, you wouldn't find it in the United States. So each of these terms have their own kind of specific history and contextual kind of histories behind them too.
I don't know, Delphine, do you have anything to add or?
To the second question?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Discourses about sexuality can be studied in the 18th century. The development of medicine and the role and influence of medicine in the society, and particularly French society for my study, medicine replacing religion like a source of knowledge in the 19th century. Medicine taken over from religion to circumscribe sexuality. But sexuality in the 17th or 18th century was described by the religion, was circumscribed by the religion, Christian religion. Sexuality sexuality had to reproductive, marital, but then there was a little discourse of the races because studies of human races developed essentially in the 19th century, but in the 18th century, the fields were about sexuality with slaves. Slaves were presented with a sexuality considered like animals or instinctive, but the discourses of the sexuality developed by medical discourses essentially in the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read this question, and then this is our last question, I think. Can we go a few more minutes, Elodie? Is that okay? That Delphine just answered, but just for anyone who needs to hear it orally read, it's from Jan Becker. She thanks everyone for the presentations and found them very inspiring. I was wondering about the temporal frame of your topics. How do scientific foci on sexuality and eugenics relate to pre-19th century understandings of human reproduction, sexuality, and its control, both in the colonies and in the metropoles? Would you consider a long-term perspective feasible in your works?
So I might try really briefly. So here's what I found just in terms of sexuality, which I did not touch on as much, but I will say, so mixed race women, which probably will come as no surprise to anyone here, become targeted. I think actually, if you look at sort of through 18th century into the 19th century into the 20th century as having a kind of sexuality that is problematic and comes under the view and scrutiny of eugenicists. So if we think, for example, back to Edward Long, who has all these things to say about mulatto women, he will say things when describing their features to say when he says they partake more of the white than the black and that their hair is like of a tolerable length. I feel like he's telegraphing a kind of desire for these women. He also talks about their gait, their easy manner. There's a clear latent sort of sexual desire, I guess you should say, underneath that discussion. But they're always seen as, he will then also say that they're promiscuous, that they have too many partners. You can also find this concern from actually Louis Agassiz in a letter to Howe, where he talks about, oh yeah, you know, the young Southern men, they have to stop with these mixed race women. They are these spicy partners, that this is what the young Southern man needs to be around, and it's a problem. Now, he never mentions where the mulatto women come from. It's sort of like he's trying to hide white male like participation in this because they just seem to appear out of nowhere. Then when you get to Davenport and actually others like E.B. Reuter, who has a more favorable view of mixed race people, there's still the issue of, oh, well, we all know that the problem in these places like Jamaica, where they have mixed race people, is promiscuity. And Davenport instructs his field workers to like get absolute assurances about the paternity of children from like the mixed race women that he's talking to the Black women that he's talking to. So I do see a long-term obsession with Black and mixed race female sexuality. The idea that the mulatto woman is somehow this irresistible woman that even Edward Long, who was clearly repulsed by the idea of race mixing, is drawn to the mulatto woman. And that on her body and sort of the fact that she's seen as the temptress that causes these like other iterations and generations of mixed race people to emerge, that there's certainly, I think, taking a long view, a scrutiny of these bodies, of their bodies that clearly go from slavery onward. And I think I would argue, I think as Jim mentioned, Jennifer Morgan has done a great job of showing this like from very early on, like settlement of Barbados, this obsession with the sexuality of Black women's bodies, and that then becoming a focal point of discussions of race mixing, because it's always their fault. The thing is, Davenport will say, well, it seems that there are these white men cohabitating, but you better check the paternity of these Black women. And I'm always sort of very, it's that arresting moment. So I appreciate that question very much.
Well, with that, I think we need to bring this to a close. There is a chat request to reiterate some recent books or recent works that we were all doing. So I can at least speak for a few, or do the ones that have titles in English so I don't re-butcher any. And maybe Elodie can help me out. But I'll say Jim Downs has a brand new book, Maladies of Empire. It's got a great cover that's sitting somewhere else in my office, and that's out right now. And Rana Hogarth, I would highly recommend her 2017 monograph, Medicalizing Blackness, which came out with UNC Press. And then she's also featured in this book that I edited with Sean Morey-Smith. And so I think those are the probably most recent things to look for from the Western side of the Atlantic. And I would also say Ezell Sanford. I don't know if he has any articles out yet, but I would look for him and follow him. He's a brilliant scholar. And I know that his work is going to blow people's minds. So.
Again, I can reintroduce Delphine's book, which actually was published this year in a French press, which is La Découverte. And her book in French is titled Corps Noir, Médecins Blancs, so Black bodies, white doctors. And it might one day be published be translated in English, which will be fantastic. And I have my book that came out in September in French as well. It's a university press, Presse Universitaire de Rennes, and the title is Bad Brains, but the rest of the book is unfortunately in French. But I have a second book coming out next year with LSU Press, which is about 19th century slavery and medical theories in the South, in the US South.
That book's titled Mad with Freedom.
Yes, Mad with Freedom.
So, thank you so much for attending, everyone. And I'm sure if you have any further questions, you can reach out to any of us. We'll be happy to be in conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.